Rana in just a little bit, as you can also see on your screen. Juan in the booth, also with us here as we start off the freedom side. And just to remind those who may be watching on YouTube, and if you're not, maybe migrate over there, to make sure that you subscribe to our channel, hit the bell, get the alerts, so that everything that we are doing will come straight to you. You don't have to go looking for it. You'll be able to get all of our content here on Breakthrough News. So if you're watching on YouTube, absolutely, please subscribe. Hit that bell so you get the alerts. And also, if you happen to be watching either on YouTube or anyone else, this is a great time to hit that share button in order to make sure that everyone who is following you is following us. We've got a fantastic show for you here tonight, as we always do. We're covering a whole range of things, from Gaza to Colombia to police brutality here in the United States of America to imperial hypocrisy in Eastern Europe. We've got a very full agenda for you. But before we get to any of that, it is very important that we start this show by noting that it is Rana's birthday today. Happy birthday, Rana. I'm just gonna clap a little bit. I don't want it to be too big. How do you feel?
I feel good. I know some people think birthdays are stupid, but I think birthdays are awesome, and I'm very excited. It's my birthday. I told you I thought we should name the show today that it's Rana's birthday. No one agreed with me, but I still stand by that.
I don't know about that. I don't think there's not a hard disagree.
Welcome to the Freedom Side episode, Rana's birthday.
That's actually all we'll be talking about tonight. Is we're going to go through Rana's life history. This is sort of a "This Is Your Life" segment. We'll be bringing out old friends, family members to reminisce.
He's in the audience.
You might be surprised. He's in the audience here tonight. For whatever reason, I'm thinking about
awesome.
Wonder Years now too. I don't know why.
Yeah,
but,
we should have like a little montage with special music from the
we
Wonder
should.
Years.
We should also have a
playing
narrator that comes in
hitting
that we can't see that explains what's
child.
going on. Anyway, happy birthday,
well.
Rana. Also,
Thank
you
you
were
very
back in
much.
Beirut. Now
I am.
you are.
I
How
am.
does it feel to be back? Are you excited? I mean, I know you are excited. To get back.
I am coming to you from 7 hours into the future.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's been. I mean, I just got back a few days ago, so it's like always an adjustment jet lag wise, and it's of course always an interesting. A little bit of an interesting culture shock. And what I mean by that is, in the US, I spent some time in the US, and I got vaccinated in the US, and things have started to feel really normal there. And then you come back to a place like Lebanon where, vaccinations, obviously, because it's not, it's not a European or first, it's not a global north country. It's not a rich country.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually in the midst of an economic collapse. So as we've talked about on the show before, this sort of vaccine apartheid, you don't see as much vaccinations here. They're not as widely available. So it's like life is like a few months ago here, if that makes sense. Like it's like being in the US, I guess, a few months ago. So that's a little odd, and it made me think like, that's how a lot of the world is living right now, whereas the rich countries have started to really move on from COVID. They can reopen schools, do more things in person. A lot of these, poorer countries and even middle income countries are really stuck in this kind of COVID limbo where everything is just staying the way it was, and what that's going to mean. Sorry, I started off on a really heavy, unfortunate topic.
Well, it's what everyone's thinking
it's
about.
Just the reality
honestly.
of it's the reality of the situation. Plus, Lebanon's, of course, things here have been interesting as well because of what was happening in Palestine the last couple of weeks. Just kind of hearing how people perceived it. Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gave a speech yesterday or 2 days ago, I think. Now I've kind of lost track of time because I'm still a little jet lagged. Where he talked about what happened in Palestine. He spoke on the Liberation Day of South Lebanon, which is when Hezbollah basically kicked the Israelis out. The Israelis occupied South Lebanon for a number of years, much in the same way that they occupy parts of Palestine.
Yeah.
And so there was the celebration of Liberation Day, and he gave a speech, and in it he mentioned that, Jerusalem's a red line, and it's not over, and if the Israelis continue their provocations, like they will go to war over this. So the region is definitely heated over this issue, and of course we've got some guests down the line in the show where we'll be talking more in depth about this kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm back in Lebanon. Good to be here, but also good to be on with you guys. And glad everybody's watching. It's the middle of night my time, so I do apologize in advance if I'm either super high on coffee or maybe a little low energy. I'll probably be somewhere,
somewhere
on that
in
spectrum
between
throughout the evening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. That gray area where you've had a lot of caffeine, but it's still late and you're still tired. Juan in the booth.
Yeah.
How you feeling?
I'm feeling great. It's a good time to be a basketball fan in New York. The Knicks and the Nets is killing it. The Nets had a sweep. These last 2 games they won straight, and then yesterday, the Knicks won. It's kind of sad though. Like I could honestly say like I wasn't really into basketball for a while or like watching any sports. There's a thing about being like a leftist that gets like a lot of their stuff, like, you know, a lot of their news from like leftist sources. You realize how like the sausage is made or how the chicken nugget is made, then everything is kind of upsetting. But I've decided to enjoy life, Eugene. So
No one here is gonna hate on you
I started
for
watching
enjoying
basketball
sports.
last year when the folks were in the bubble. And again, after a long, long time, and I've been like following the Nets really heavily this season, even though there's some hate, including from you and Marcus in this team.
I mean, look, we're gonna see what happens. I'm not a hater of the Nets, but at a certain point, you've just got too many players on the team. Like you
that's what
can't
we
have
wanna see.
everyone in the league on
That's
the
what we
team.
wanna
I mean,
see.
at a certain point,
That's
someone
what
has
we
to
wanna
do
see.
something.
They haven't been in the championship. They haven't won a championship since 2002.
Wow. Okay.
You know,
well, it is a good time
bring
for New York
everybody on.
basketball.
We
And
need
it
help.
is reopening, and the Garden was packed.
The Garden was
in the game. This was one of the
packed.
games I saw this weekend. So yeah, I mean, I guess here we
Not
go.
too-
I think 50% of Americans now have at least one shot.
Yeah.
The good news is though that some new research has come out saying that it's possible that even one shot, but both shots could actually give you immunity for years. So,
that's good.
I mean, we obviously don't know that much about what's going on because 2 months ago they said you're gonna have to get a 3rd shot.
I'm just gonna go
But I
kiss
guess this
everyone
research
and
that has
see.
come out is that it gets in your bone marrow, the antibodies. And so it's possible that
Really?
you may have immunity for some long, very long period of time.
It felt like it got in my
Bad
bone
news
marrow.
for Pfizer
My
and
arm was
Moderna
hurting.
because they want to give boosters as soon as possible.
I suspect that
That's
we
really
will be
good-
in
that's really
booster
good to hear.
territory. Go ahead,
yeah,
Lana.
yeah. Well, I was gonna say, I was trapped between the two of you talking about sports, and not to be a cliche of a woman, but I used to follow sports.
You used to
I
be a
don't have
point
time
guard.
anymore because
Come on.
I
Basketball.
played basketball, and I'm very short, so I can only be a point guard. Let's be clear about that.
You can be a shooting guard. I'd like to see your
But-
post game, and we'll see where we put you in the lineup.
Well, it's been a while, but I'm confident. I'm confident I can still do quite well. But I did want to note, you guys are talking about the NBA. We should give a shout out to the Anti-Defamation League, which is now going to be advising the NBA. I mean, does anybody know what is even happening? I just saw a headline. My apologies.
I
for
think
not
all
reading-
that's happening is the headline. In my experience, when sports leagues announce that anyone is advising them about anything, that is the story.
Why the NBA
It's-
though? Like,
it's
why
so
does the NBA
garbage.
need to
I
be
think-
advised by a pro-Israel lobby on how not to
Who
hate
knows?
people?
Who knows?
But
Some
we all know that
PR,
ADL
somebody's
actually
friend.
doesn't.
I don't know.
It's so
But yeah.
garbage.
Well, I think so. I'll tell you my theory. My theory is that there's been a lot of activism among athletes, among Black
Yeah.
athletes in particular, around police killings, taking the knee with Colin Kaepernick, and then in the past couple of decades, there's actually been quite a bit of activism with socially aware athletes, getting good on Palestine and being pro-Palestine. And I can only imagine, I mean, the ADL, we all know it poses and masquerades as this anti-hate group, but in reality, it's actually like an arm of the Israel lobby that, even used to spy, help the U.S. spy on anti-apartheid activists back in the 80s and also Arabs who were pro-Palestine in the U.S. But anyway, all that's to say is the only reason the ADL would be getting involved in a sport that is pretty dominated by people of color. Like, they don't really need to, I don't think that if you're going to talk about white supremacy in the NBA, it's going to be among coaches. But anyway, that said, I can only imagine that the reason that they'd be advising is to get in the way of players taking a stand on
Yeah.
Israel-Palestine.
That's exactly what it is.
In a way
Yeah.
that's against Israel's policies, and
Yeah.
that's pro-Palestinian rights.
Indeed.
So,
It's-
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, while we're shouting out terrible people and organizations, I wanted to mention something that happened yesterday. The Senate Banking Committee had a hearing where they brought a number of big bankers up there to talk about, big banks. Nevertheless, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JPMorgan, was there, and there was a bit of a exchange that happened between him and Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio about his salary, how high it is, and how they decide it. So I want to quickly go to that, and then let's react to it.
Let me shift to Mr. Dimon. Mr. Dimon, at most of your banks, the CEO makes for all of you, that most of your banks, the CEO makes 800 or 900 times your lowest paid worker. So, Mr. Dimon, help me understand this. I don't think any of us on this panel or any of the senators asking questions thinks that you work 900 times harder than the tellers and customer service agents at JPMorgan Chase. So help me understand this. How did we end up here where CEOs are making 900 times what some of their workers are making?
We're very proud of the opportunity we give to all of our people here. Our starting wages are approximately $35,000 plus medical benefits, retirement benefits. We take very good care of our people in terms of training and all that. My compensation is set by the board. They look at multiple factors, and that's how it takes place.
So 900 times the bank tellers, and as Senator Brown noted, it's obviously he doesn't work 900 times as hard. One thing I want to pick up on here is that he said the board looks at a number of factors, and they paid him $31.5 million last year. Now, what I'm curious about, Rana and Juan, is if one of those factors was the fact that JPMorgan got hit with 2 felony counts in September of last year for rigging. Well, I'm actually just going to read this to you. It's really amazing. This is what 2 felony counts for tens of thousands of instances of unlawful trading in gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, as well as thousands of incidents of unlawful trading in U.S. Treasury future contracts and U.S. Treasury notes and bonds. So they were basically rigging markets for precious metals and U.S. Treasuries. Somehow, despite tens of thousands of incidents, they only got 2 felony counts. And then the board, in their consideration of factors, they did not consider that it appears that it's just a criminal enterprise, and they handed him $31.5 million. I mean, what else can you really say about capitalism right there, Rana?
I don't think you can say anything else. I think that man's money should be confiscated and handed out to people who actually, the pay discrepancy alone is just mind-boggling to me. There's people
times.
who are scraping by on, literally not even paycheck to paycheck. They're just credit to credit, debt to debt. And then this guy is just, how many yachts does he own? I mean, the level of...
Question.
But this is capitalism. It's not, I don't want to make it about an individual. Jamie Dimon's an awful person. And we all know politically he sucks. But at the same time, there's so many people like him because we have a capitalist system that has this massive inequality where people like him get to walk away with just insane amounts of money. And it's never enough for them. And it's just legalized corruption. I don't know what else to say about that.
The thing that kind of blew me away, Juan, is he was like, well, you're making 900 times more than the average bank teller. What do you think about that? And his first response was, well, listen, we're proud. We're offering people $35,000. I don't know if he knew that's what he was saying, but he basically was saying we are proud that I am paid 900 times the average bank teller.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, Brown was saying to you, we don't think that you do the work, you don't do 900 times the work, but that's not really what the system is about. The system is about paying somebody the minimal amount of work possible to make the maximum amount of profits. And to me, this round of questioning, this was the same interview, the same questioning that he had last year, the year before. There's a clip that's basically him saying the same thing, that the board pays him whatever the board decides. And the thing is that the critique on capitalism, it from within capitalism is just, it makes no sense. Yeah. Because the thing is that today Biden had a press conference and he said multiple times during the press conference, I am a capitalist. And that's what capitalism is exploiting workers, is how do you make money, right? How do you make the most amount of money possible? And there's a shift in what workers are accepting, what people are accepting, and that's why there's these criticisms. But honestly, JPMorgan Chase shouldn't even exist. If we're really a society that was learned from its mistakes, JPMorgan Chase owned slaves. That's the history of JPMorgan slaves. Not JPMorgan slaves. That was the Freudian slip. But yeah, so we can't expect anything more. We can't expect anything more from these corporations because look what they're rooted in. The same way we can't expect anything more from the system because look what it's rooted in.
It kind of reminds me of that back and forth. Because Juan, you're saying like capitalists like interrogating other capitalists.
Yeah.
It's just like this performance you see all the time. It kind of reminds me of like in dictatorships. In order to make people feel heard, they'll like have these ways for them to like call in and like complain about local issues, or like go on the media and complain about local issues, so that people have like a way to feel like they're being heard in some way. And honestly, like we think we live in a democracy, but we absolutely do not. We live in this like capitalist dictatorship where it's all this performance. Like that's a performance so that people can see that and think, oh, there are people fighting for us, but they're not actually fighting for you, because they're not even talking about the real cause of that, which is exactly what Juan just laid out. Like that's a system problem, not an individual problem. Like Jamie Dimon makes 900 times what a bank teller makes, because the system is designed, as Juan just explained, to be that way, to pay people as little as possible so you can extract the most profit possible from their labor. And until that's the conversation, like we're just gonna keep seeing those kinds of meaningless performances that don't ever go anywhere. Like we've been having the same conversation for decades.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, just to bring it home, Goldman Sachs was also up there testifying. Also last fall, Goldman Sachs was convicted of a felony. It was the 1MDB scandal, if you know that. But basically what it comes down to is Goldman Sachs was part of a conspiracy to pay $1.6 billion in bribes, violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. No one went to jail for any of this, by the way, in terms of these big banks. But it just, I mean, imagine if they had a hearing on homicides in America, and everyone who came to testify had like just killed 15 people. I mean, that's basically what it is. They're having to argue. They're having a hearing about about big banks being way too big and whether there's too much systemic risk. And they bring all these people on who have been convicted, or leading these banks that have been convicted of all these crimes. Some of them last year, involving billions of dollars, the rigging of markets, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act being violated. I mean, just everything. And as you're saying, Rania, they're up there doing this performance as if it's somehow some sort of legitimate thing. I mean, it really is unbelievable when you think about it. Like, in what, quote unquote crime just that affects normal people would they ever have that happen? I mean, if you steal $100 from a gas station with a butter knife, they want to put you under the jail.
Right.
I'm ranting now.
I mean, it's like the same thing like in Florida.
No, it's
right?
a good rant.
Ron DeSantis is trying to pass this bill, or just passed this bill, where like if you're silent by social media, that you can sue. But like that's an issue now. That's an issue now because right wingers are the ones that are being silenced. Right. But when left wing media in the last 4, 5, 6 years have been silenced on Facebook and Twitter, there was no bill being passed. There was no like. There was no attack against like these like really the richest people in the world. Yeah. Right. And Jimmy Dimon is not the richest man in the world. Like I wonder what the percentage is between like Jeff Bezos and an average Amazon worker.
I'm pretty sure it's like over 1,000 times. That's probably why he was like saying he was proud of the 900 number, because it actually is lower than other CEO to worker ratios in terms of pay. But again, system we live in.
I think Pepsi a few years ago was like some 1,000 times. But yeah, I mean, the scale of it, as you're saying, Juan, is so correct. I might be getting this stat wrong, but the amount of money that Jeff Bezos could give every Amazon employee a $250,000 bonus, and he would basically, the amount of money he would lose is he would just have the same amount of money he had before the pandemic, when like he was also the richest man. So he would lose absolutely nothing to give every single Amazon employee $250,000, which then just lets you know how ridiculous it is that they're having people working in these terrible conditions.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, to like backtrack a little bit, because it just like, I feel like these points kind of coincide. Like the Anti-Defamation League being involved in the NBA, like it is so much about the players, and it's like that's what you see. Like that's when you see things happen when it's affecting like a group that it needs to be controlled, right? Because how many NBA owners, like owners of teams, donated to Trump, have donated to like right-wing organizations, but there's no kind of control over that, right? That you have literally like the former owner of the NBA team in, I think it's in Atlanta, right? the WNBA team in Atlanta.
Oh, yeah, Kelly Loeffler. Yep.
Yeah, like running for office, being a right winger, donating, right? But when the players start speaking, it's like shut up and play, right? When the players start speaking, we need to bring people in. Like this past week, Kyrie was talking about how he's going back to Boston since he left. And he said that hopefully it isn't as like the race, like the subtle racism that he got while he was playing there doesn't come back. And he was being attacked by former basketball players. They're like, oh, you know, Boston is a great place to, like, you can't talk about racism. You can't talk about Palestine. You can't talk about like police brutality. Like anything that is spoken about that's actually part like a systematic issue.
Yeah.
You get silence. And that's like a macrocosm, because these are like some rich people that are in front of cameras all the time. But that's the reality for teachers. There was a teacher that was saying that I think in the Bronx, there was a teacher saying that like that they should talk to the school and be involved in BDS, and people are demanding for her to be fired. Which is insane.
It is. Well, let's leave the criminals of Wall Street behind for now. We could have 8 shows in a row on that because I don't want to get libeled here or be accused of libel, but there are many bad people there. Well, we are going to turn the agenda here to a very important issue, really a crucial issue. And, you know, many of you, of course, were following us last week where we were doing live streams. Give me 1 second. We're just waiting to get this guest on, but we're going to turn the issue to Gaza, hopefully soon here. Obviously, this is still an ongoing issue, Rana, in so many different ways. I mean, it's one of those things that I feel that, you know, the cameras often go away, but when you look at what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah in particular, in Jerusalem as well, I mean, the level of popular resistance that's still continuing there in, you know, all across Jerusalem and the West Bank, different places, the struggle certainly hasn't ended. And even though there's sort of a lesser focus on it, I think it is important to note that, I mean, it's still acute there.
Well, not just that. I mean, so we've had a ceasefire, right? That's been in place, which is good. The ceasefire is a very good thing. Gaza a week ago was being basically carpet bombed. And we reported on that last week, just the level of devastation. But, you know, in the aftermath, as the story is kind of starting to disappear from the headlines a bit, the suffering continues, right? There is a ceasefire, so there aren't bombs falling, but there's still a siege on Gaza. Gaza's been under an air, land, and sea blockade for the past 15 years. And that continues after all of the devastation of Israel's bombardment, on top of killing 66 children. A part of the 244 people death toll that we saw. On top of that, there's an insane amount of destruction. Entire apartment buildings were leveled by the Israelis. And so, you know, the only COVID clinic was bombed. So, you know, people's family homes were destroyed in airstrikes where they didn't get any warnings. And so you have to think about the aftermath of that, and a place like Gaza where they can't even get the proper building material they need. We saw Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, went to visit the region. He went to visit, he did a press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu a few days ago, and he stood there and he repeatedly talked about Israel's security, made no mention of the Palestinian devastation on the Palestinian side, barely like kind of just passed over people on both sides are hurt, civilians dying, but didn't mention who. And then he talked about how it's a priority of the United States to make sure that none of the aid that goes into Gaza after all this destruction goes to Hamas. So that's the priority of the US, making sure that Hamas doesn't benefit from the aid. And that goes back into the blockade. Gaza's under blockade because they voted Hamas into power. In elections, the US demanded, and ever since then, it's been under blockade. And there's been 3 devastating wars on Gaza, and people can't get the building materials they need in because of this blockade. It's completely outrageous. Meanwhile, the US just, you know, passed the $735 million arms sale to Israel. Yep. And the US is continuing with its $3.8 billion of unconditional military assistance to Israel every year. So, you know, it's just, the war for Gaza isn't over. The bombs have stopped dropping, but the war on Gaza continues.
Yes, it absolutely does. And I think that's a good note to turn to our first guest here. And we are very honored to be joined by Rana Shubair, who is a Gaza-based author and a contributor to We Are Not Numbers. Rana, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you guys.
Mm-hmm.
So
can you hear me
Rana,
fine?
Yeah, we can hear you. So we're really happy to have you on. You're coming to us from Gaza. There's been a ceasefire in effect since last week. It's been, I think, 5 or 6 days. So why don't you give us an idea of how have things shifted since the bombs stopped falling? What are people, talking about? What's the situation on the ground in terms of the rubble? Are people starting to figure out how they're going to rebuild? How are people putting things back together? Are they able to put their lives back together?
Yeah, so it's been a week since the ceasefire came into effect. And honestly, like last week, I got a message from you guys for me to join, and I saw it late, but I was not in my mental state to talk because I got numerous messages from different people around the world. And I guess this was I was in the shock stage. I was trying to absorb what had just happened. And even a week after, I still find it very difficult to fathom, the enormity of the massacres that took place. Because just down my street, 3 major massacres took place where the Israeli warplanes bombed streets and assuming that there were tunnels under the pavement. And what happened was two residential buildings collapsed as a result of bombing the street, and 3 families were massacred. So people are just this past week they're still waking up from this nightmare and trying to gather the pieces of their shattered lives. Just today, I went to pay condolences to one of those people from AbuKhalil family. She told us that 14 members of her family were killed. She survived along with 1 sister and her brother and father, and her mother is in very critical condition. And the whole time we were sitting there, she was just, she was telling us how she was trapped for 2 hours under the rubble. The rubble is just down my street. There are like a very huge mountain of rubble in front of what used to be the building where these people lived. And honestly, when I walk past them, I just try to shut my eyes. I don't want to see the rubble because it's really hard to imagine that there were people living there, and in the middle of the night as they slept, they were bombed to death. This was one family, and another family also, who was bombed, had 22 members of this family killed, and one of them was a close friend of mine. She was killed along with her husband and 2 of her 3 sons, and one of them survived, and to spend the rest of his life, traumatized, I guess, by this. So I think people this week, they're just waking up from this nightmare, trying to make sense of what happened. And I think everyone is traumatized at this stage, because whenever I see people, they're just expressing how they're still trying to make sense of what has happened in the past 11 days.
And I'm curious about, as much as you just described a lot of the trauma and devastation, there was also unprecedented unity, it seemed like, among Palestinians, where you saw an outpouring of solidarity and support from across 48 Palestine, from across the West Bank, in a way that hasn't happened in a very long time. So I'm curious if that's a part of the conversation, this kind of unity, and the fact that Palestinians put up quite a bit, a lot of resistance to what took place. And that resistance is ongoing in many ways. So has that played a part in the kinds of conversations you're having on the ground and giving people some sense of, I guess, hope, if you will?
Yeah, I think this Israeli military aggression was different than the 3 aggressions we went through, in the sense that we did, even before it started, we witnessed Palestinian where in 1948 Palestine, in West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, they're all united under one motto, to free Jerusalem, to stop the settler colonialism, to stop those settlers from, kicking people, harassing people out of their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. And they just stood up to say no to this settler colonialism project. And it also happened, as Palestinians took to the borders from Jordan, from Lebanon, and in the diaspora everywhere. And this gave us a new sense of hope that this time that the rules on the ground have changed, that we're no longer alone. I know we faced this aggression by ourselves, and we bore the brunt of all these attacks, but we were really hopeful. We were really very optimistic when we saw all these protests around the world, which still continue till this day. And I think that this is something that the Israeli occupation has always meant to do, is segment the Palestinian people, politically, geographically. I mean, when you look at us in Gaza, by visit our own country, my own kids been asked, why can't we visit the cities that we study about in our school books? They study about Palestinian cities, which they've never seen, and they're just trying to make understand or just trying to imagine what they look like from dull pictures in their books, but they can't visit. So the Israeli occupation has always meant to fragment the Palestinian people, and in the West Bank, it's the story is even much worse, where cities are divided by the apartheid wall, and the West Bank is like it's divided from the rest of Palestine. It's checkpoints are spread throughout, and people can't travel they easily from one city. So this round of fighting, if I may call it, the circumstances surrounding it really gave us lots of hope, because everybody, all Palestinians all around in 1948, in the West Bank, in Jordan, Lebanon, they all stood with us, and they all stood with Jerusalem and the people Israel's trying to forcibly evict out of their homes. So I think that for me, I felt that it ushers a new era of the struggle. It's not going to be the same as it was in the past, because we stood up for Jerusalem when we started this. When we told the Israelis that we're not going to just sit in silence and turn a blind eye to all their harassment and killing of people. So yes, I think that this is a new phase in the Palestine.
And so just to remind our viewers, we are speaking to Rana Shubair. She's a Gaza-based author and contributor to We Are Not Numbers. Rana, I'm curious, I think something like 80% of people in Gaza are either the refugees or the descendants of refugees from 48 Palestine, from what's now considered Israel. I'm curious, what about your family? Is your family originally from Gaza or a different town?
Yeah, so when I'm often asked this question, I mean, I tell people, and they're often surprised, because I take part in so many activism here, especially the Great Return March, which took place 2 years ago. I'm originally from Gaza. I'm not a refugee, but I like to always say that I belong to all of Palestine, and I take action in anything that concerns my people.
I'm always curious. And there are lots of people, of course, who are from Gaza originally, but it's always interesting to hear about so many people who live in Gaza now who are actually from the border towns, the towns that are over the fence from Gaza, and were kicked out of there. But so speaking back to the situation on the ground, we heard a lot about, right now you still have COVID in Gaza, unlike the Israelis who have mostly been vaccinated. Palestinians have not been afforded the same level of vaccination. We saw during the airstrikes on Gaza that the only COVID testing clinic was bombed by the Israelis. So what's the medical situation like? How are the hospitals faring? How is the COVID situation? Are people still getting sick with COVID? And do they have anywhere to go to get treatment after a bombing campaign like this?
Yeah, so before the aggression, I mean, COVID was, I think it reached like other places around the world, and daily deaths. There was a COVID clinic, as you mentioned, which was destroyed. But I really don't have information about whether they have restored this clinic in any other place or not. But I've been hearing that the medical situation on the ground is very is always deteriorating. Even before this military aggression, the Ministry of Health always seems to run out of medicine, of medical equipment. There's always need of medical staff. This makes people who need critical operations and treatment. They're always in need to travel outside of Gaza to get treatment, and this is not something easy because when Palestine wants to travel into occupied Palestine, Israel, they're not always given a permit. They can be denied based on Israeli allegations that they pose a security threat, or they can just not be given any answer. And the other alternative is to travel through Egypt and seek medication there, or travel from Egypt to another country outside. So medical treatment and access to proper medical treatment has always been very problematic for Palestinians here. Many people have died, especially at the beginning of the first few years of the siege, when it was very tight and there were very restrictions on travel, and the border, the Rafah border, was always closed. These days, I mean, I always hear that the Ministry of Health is making appeals to urge, the world or countries to help them, entry to medicine, proper medical equipment. And there's always negotiations and talks, which take place on a monthly basis, just to allow entry of these medicines and goods, because Israel controls what goes in and out, and we always have to keep demanding these necessities the country has. In Gaza, we have, and we have to keep demanding and asking to things. And it's the same thing for the COVID equipment and kits and tools. There is always calls, to coordinate with certain, officials and parties in order to allow these kits and equipment to come in.
Well, Rana Shubair, Gaza-based author and contributor to We Are Not Numbers, thank you so much for coming on and giving us a layout of what Gaza is dealing with in the aftermath of this devastating, horrible bombing campaign that we all witnessed. We really appreciate you coming on Breakthrough News. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Well, Rania, obviously, in many ways, very tragic, but a brave resistance there in Gaza and across Palestine. So inspirational, and I think important to hear about the impact that it was offering hope to people in Gaza to see these huge demonstrations that are ongoing around the world. So fantastic stuff there. We're going to move the conversation here to another very important issue, and that is the ongoing, protest and movement to get justice for Andrew Brown Jr., who was murdered by Elizabeth City, North Carolina police. And we are very happy to be joined here as we continue the show by Alana Houston, who is an anti-racist organizer in Elizabeth City. Alana, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you. Oh, sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. This is our remote life here. Well, a lot has happened, obviously. I'm sure you have probably there's so much happening being there in Elizabeth City, even seeing it from outside.
Yes.
We've had the video come out. We've had the attack on the car attack on protesters. Maybe where I want to start is, so there was so much conversation about what was in the video. We had heard some from different people. Now it's out. What has been the response there on the ground now that at least some of what took place is now out there in the public domain?
So there's not a lot that has been released and everything. But what has been released, we're of course angry. We want more footage. We want, we just need more. We want transparency. So that leads to protests, but also just like the protests that are actually on the ground, they're being like the sheriff is bribing us to stop marching through like emails and
Wow.
like it's crazy. Like we're actually being escorted by the police because they're forcing us to file for a parade permit, to I guess negate all of the arrests that could be made, even though there has been like over 20. I think the number might be maybe 32. We see like many people, like many racist people come through like with their cars, and they're trying to like act like they're hitting the bike riders that are with us, act like they're going to they actually do hit protesters, and the cops we see them let them get away. There's nothing being done about it at all, and we are clearly made out to be the enemy, even though we're just marching for change and marching for Andrew.
I mean, how indicative of this, or maybe how surprised are you that these sorts of things are happening? I mean, I think that obviously people from around the world always see these incidents. They oftentimes seem shocking, and perhaps they should seem shocking given the intensity of police activity. But I mean, is this, I hate to say par for the course, but I mean, is this the culture there in Elizabeth City, this kind of racist policing and targeting of activists, and of course, the murder of Andrew Brown Jr.? I mean, is this surprising in terms of the broader realities of Elizabeth City?
No, and I see what you're saying. As sad as it sounds, surprising, no, it's not surprising, especially considering how the police system even came about. I mean, it was founded on slave patrols, and in the North, it was founded on I think maybe I'm not sure, but I'm from the South, so all I can speak of is slave patrol. So surprising, no. This is in their job description, it's just to target colonized people, target Black and brown people all the time. But what is surprising for me isn't even the murder. What's surprising for me is that people are still so close-minded to think that all cops aren't bad. So we are marching, and then right before the march, since it is such a small town, these police officers, they know us by name. The protesters know the police officers by name. So everybody just seems okay. And it's more of like the facade of, well, not my police officer type of situation. Like, well, maybe the police officers that executed him, but not the police officers that I'm giving a thumbs up to, or the police officers that I'm shaking hands with, or that I go to church with on Sunday.
I think that's such a good point. There's such a facade that exists. I mean, I'm from a small southern town, Charlottesville, same thing. There's such a facade when people know each other, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's all fine. We're not like those other terrible places. But this has been, I mean, to me, even the way the video has been handled, Alana, it speaks so much to that. I mean, I know there's court issues and different things like that, but it just feels like at every turn, the police are determined to limit the amount of information that people really have to judge what took place.
Oh yeah. And we have one of the people that are on the ground. They've tried to reach out to the sheriff's department just to call for a meeting, and they responded with, "Well, we can have the meeting, but only X, Y, and Z can happen. 30 people are the only people that are allowed, and you can only give me 10 questions. And if we do this as prior discussed, we would stop protesting. So if I give you the footage, you give us the streets back."
Wow.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I don't want to I don't want to derail the conversation with this particular issue, but I can't help but think, it's my birthday, I'm allowed to. But I can't help but think, Alana and Eugene, thank you. But I can't help but think, of the conversation that's been taking place the last week since the war on Palestine, or the war on Gaza, came to a ceasefire, which was, there was this attempt by the Israel lobby, right? And I promise I'm getting back to this. It's going to come full circle. But there was this attempt by the Israel lobby to try and detract from the horrors that took place in Gaza by taking these incidences that happened where like these pro-Israel protesters would physically assault and attack pro-Palestine protesters and then videotape the response. And the response would be to like hit back. And then they would be like, oh my God, Jews are being attacked. They're attacking me because I'm Jewish. And it was these far-right people in many cases, these far-right Israel supporters. And there was this whole, the media went with it, and it became the whole narrative we all saw got spun into, oh my God, Jews are under attack. Not the 66 children who were killed in Palestine, but Jews in America are under attack based on these like fraudulent claims by these Israel supporters. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because like, if we're going to talk about racism in America, and I'm not saying anti-Semitism isn't a problem, it is. But when you look at who's being attacked, we have Black people on the regular basis being gunned down by police. And then we have people being attacked at a protest by a hateful person who deliberately ran into them and tried to kill them. And that isn't the first time that's happened, right? We've actually, this is what frustrates me about the conversation to detract. If you want to detract from Palestine to talk about racism in America, the conversation about racism in America should not be about a bunch of people like Bari Weiss feeling like people online are hurting her feelings and that's violence. Like, it should be about actual racism. And just hearing this conversation that's happening right now makes me even angrier about the crazy narrative that got spun this week after the war on Palestine. That's my full circle. I just wanted to make that comment and go ahead and respond. I assume you agree because you're nodding.
Yeah. I mean, yes, and especially since like you're talking about how people are filming them, and you know the human response would be to like hit back, right? So
yeah.
It's really like
when like a racist attacks you.
I mean, that's the human reaction, and when people of color are attacked and everything, and I'm a person of color. So like when I'm attacked, I'm going to hit back. That is the human reaction. But this entire system, and honestly, all of America, is based on the fact that Black people, brown people, indigenous people, people of color are not allowed to be human. They're not given the right to be human or have human responses. So that's the issue that we're running into right now, especially like in small towns and also like all over the world, like you were saying, like in Palestine, and just nobody of color is allowed to be human, because how it all started in the first place is we weren't human. We were slaves. We were property. We were, traded around, and it's a mess.
I mean, that's such a good point. It just, when I watched the video, I was thinking so much about the Emmanuel AME shooting several years ago in Charleston, because just the way they rolled on Mr. Brown, like when you see the video, it was like something out of Afghanistan, like the way they're in the truck, the tactical gear, to serve a warrant on one person, and then they're just wantonly firing all over the neighborhood. And I was like, man, this dude shot up a church like 4 years ago, and they were able to apprehend him. They took him to Burger King, and they're out here serving a warrant, which means that you don't even know if the person did what they've been accused of. And you're rolling on him like it's the raid to kill Osama bin Laden. I mean, it was, again, it's not
like
surprising, Alana,
them,
but it
like
was
these huge guns. Like it was completely ridiculous.
And, this is also a small town, so you think, what's the cost of that? What is the impact? I mean, why do they even have these things? I mean, I know we always say this when there are police killings because it is so outrageous, but it really did say to me something about how they view everyone, not just Andrew Brown Jr., but certainly him. And even the way it's been in the media, Alana, and I'm curious your thoughts about that, have been like, well, this guy was a violent drug dealer, so we didn't have a choice. How has the media narrative been there locally?
Well, there are a few public pages and everything that have a whole bunch of numbers, and people are just excited about the numbers, like, oh yeah, like we have thousands and thousands of people like liking our page. They're always commenting on our pictures, but most people fail to realize that not everybody that likes the page is for the page, is for the movement. So we have tons and tons of people getting all of our information out. We have tons of people just like, I don't know, following us around like through the protest and screaming like, don't do drugs, instead of like, I guess in retort to us saying, say his name, Andrew Brown, and they say, well, don't do drugs. And just people just shaking their head like and I keep saying it's a mess. It's really a mess. And to like go back on the why, like, how do they even have the guns and everything. So Elizabeth City is actually involved in a 1033 program. So the 1033 program, I'm sure you know what it is and everything. It's when the military grants access to excess military grade weapons. Elizabeth City only has 18,000 people in it. Why on earth do we need military grade weapons here other than, you know, having violent acts of terrorism? Because that's kind of what it is to me. This is an act of terrorism.
Juan in the booth. I can hear you because I'm in the studio, but okay.
I can't hear you, Juan. Juan has been silenced by himself. He has silenced himself.
You have the power, Juan.
Let Juan speak.
Okay, well,
Yeah, let's get a hashtag rolling for Juan.
All right, well, we're going to get Juan, we're going to get his audio ready and bring you back in. Just let me know when you're ready, Juan. But I think that's actually deeply notable, Alana, that they're involved in the 1033 program. And it also speaks to, like, the impact of these sorts of things. I mean, I know in the so-called George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that is in Congress right now that will never pass. It seems like they actually let it go. But one of the things they said is, well, we're going to end giving away the military-grade weaponry, and, you know, fine, end it. But already there's so much in the hands of all these police departments, and it just feels like it's not really about ending any of this in terms of the program itself, but demilitarizing this institution.
It'll be interesting also to see, I mean, with this wind down of the war in Afghanistan, obviously there aren't that many American troops left in Afghanistan, but there's a lot of equipment that's being taken back. And we know with the 1099 program that a lot of that weaponry is coming, right? It's like unused military equipment that's then, so do we have Juan back finally?
I'm back.
But it's unused military equipment. And whenever a war winds down, that military equipment has to go somewhere. And it often ends up in the hands of these small town police departments, like as if they have IED. Like, it's always funny to me when I see some like small town police department with like armored personnel carrier. Like, I'm sorry, are people planting IEDs like on the side of the road in your small town? Has that ever even happened? Like, what do you even need a drone for? I don't understand.
Yeah. I mean, also, like, more and more, these police departments are just becoming occupying forces in communities. We had Phil Agnew on like 2 months now. Like, it's hard to tell time, but he said, like, there's a reason why this is happening, right? We're seeing the gap between the rich and the poor grow. So, like, as like there's a larger critique from like working people, from oppressed people, from the young people in the streets, like their answer is always going to be violence. I want to show a clip real quick, just from the DA. Something that like really baffled me. It's short, it's some 20-second clip.
Okay, when you employ a car in a manner that puts officers' lives in danger, that is a threat. And I don't care what direction you're going, forward, backward, sideways. I don't care if you're stationary, and neither do our courts and our case law.
So if y'all heard that correct, like it doesn't matter what direction you're going, right? Forward, backwards, or stationary. Stationary means not moving, right? So if you're a black person in a car, death is justified because you were in a car. If the police think that you're a threat, just sitting in the car could be off, right? And it doesn't matter to the police department, and it doesn't matter to the courts. That's something that really sticks out, because we can be like the police are a force, but also the courts play their role.
Yeah, Alana, I'm curious your reaction to that video. I mean, I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of this guy.
Yes, and I also want to note that not only did he say that it was justified to use excessive force, he said it was justified to use deadly force. Yeah. So he knew, like, and what he was saying and everything about whether it be stationary, that's like, I mean, being born black, being born brown, and driving a car and just parking the car, like he was saying, it's a death sentence, and it's literally comply or die. But it's, what are we even complying to? You know, like what should we do? Like help me to understand what
The
we
way they
need to
pulled up,
do.
the way they pulled up on that
You-
pickup truck, it looked like they were ready to kill. They weren't ready for anything else. They were
Yes.
not there to get anybody peacefully. The way that they rolled up in that pickup truck with rifles in their hands, looking like they're in a war zone, looking like they're in an action film, like they were ready to kill. Like you only get what you prepare yourself for. How long was that altercation? The so-called altercation? 40 seconds?
If that.
If that.
It was, yeah, I mean, everything about, I mean, I had not seen that clip. I can't believe he said, even if it's stationary. What are you
I also
talking
like
about?
it just when police officers like or sheriffs or whatever chiefs of police talk like that, they always try to talk about police officers like there's some sort of community, like the way that like the way that they
They're a
always talk about the
gang.
intelligence
They're a
community.
gang.
Yes.
They are a gang, but
Or a
like a
clan.
community as though like they're like some minority or like they're a part of like an identity group. Like, no, your job is to be a police officer. Sometimes that can be being a police officer can be a dangerous job. That's a part of the job you signed up for. You're not like it's like, are your police officers suddenly snowflakes that they have to act like Rambo all the time? Like everybody's out to get them. But I mean, beyond that, like, I don't think Americans, I always say this whenever I'm out of the country. I live outside of the US, and whenever I'm in the US, I very quickly just become accustomed again to being scared of police. Like police are they're scary in America. They're scariest obviously if you're Black, but also I don't think people in America realize, even people who aren't Black, don't realize how there is this kind of fear that you have from when you're a kid, like of American police specifically, that does not exist in other countries. Because in other countries, like even police states, the police aren't as terrifying and scary and armed up and like treating everyone like an enemy the way they are in the US. It's like a very American phenomenon. Like it's not like that in the Middle East. It's not like that in any European country I've ever been to. It's a very American thing. Like it's just when you see a cop, you get uncomfortable. Like, oh my God, am I doing anything wrong? Can they like give me a ticket for something? It's a very American thing. And of course, there's an added layer of that if you're from the wrong community or have the wrong color skin. And it's like, that's not normal. Like, it's not normal for a country's security forces to behave that way and for people to feel like so uptight around them all the time. That's not normal.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I think that's true. I mean, just the way they were recklessly shooting in this situation. I mean, there's houses everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it honestly is just so frustrating to me, Alana, all the times that you have to even like adjudicate the video. I mean, the fact that there's this back and forth, well, what was he doing? I mean, it basically looks like he's getting out of a parking spot in a grocery store. Like, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that this was not some, violent attempt to kill people.
Right. And if you notice in the video and everything, they were in the front and then they run to the side. Nobody was behind him.
Yeah.
Like there was no officer behind him at all. He backed up. He could have went forward.
Yeah, he could have. If he wanted to run over somebody, he could have. But he didn't.
And he decided to back up. And it was a fight or flight moment, a human moment. And again, that draws me back to my point. Like Black and brown people are not allowed to be human. They are dehumanized in America. And to go back to
sorry. I was going to ask, like, given everything that you're dealing with at this moment, you and other people who are protesting this issue, it's been a year since George Floyd was murdered on video. It's been a year since there was these massive protests across the nation. And it's like, I don't know where all that went. I don't know if it's because Democrats got elected and then because the officer who killed George Floyd was actually charged. Like, has that made this issue not as headline worthy, do you feel like, because of that? Like, has that pacified maybe the media or like liberals from thinking this is still a problem because one officer got charged?
I don't know. I still
That's a hard
honestly
question,
don't even
but
think
yeah.
that I honestly don't even think that George Floyd got the attention he deserved. Even though there was so many people, like, because if he got the attention that he deserved, then there would already be a change. The same things wouldn't happen over and over and over again. And it's like, we have to meet it at the source. Like, yes, like we are protesting and everything, but the source always seems to be the exact same thing. And it is police. It's the cops. And I think beyond reform, I think honestly, there needs to be, you know, really just a sit down time and be like, hey, like, why are cops here? Why do they have so much power? Like, why is it that we call the cops, call 911 for everything, call the cops for a domestic violence case, call the cops for a traffic violation, call the cops for a murder, call the cops for a drug overdose? Like, I feel like there definitely needs to be a redistribution of the funds that go into the cops, because there is no reason why one badge can carry so much power. They're not gods.
Right.
They're not.
Yeah.
No, I think that's so important.
And instead of this conversation needs to be being had instead of like these sort of performative gestures that we get from our political leaders who campaign on them and do nothing about it. I mean, do you guys remember when Nancy Pelosi and like all those members of Congress wore those Kente scarves? Like, I don't even know what they were thinking, but they all wore those Kente scarves and like took a knee for George Floyd. But like, I'd rather you, instead of doing that weird, really weird thing, like imagine being the Nancy Pelosi's assistant who had to call and order those scarves. But anyways, the point is like that gesture was made and it meant nothing because now this party's in power and they're not even talking about this anymore. Like they literally just used it as a campaign slogan.
Right.
Well, no, go ahead, Lana.
I was just gonna say there are so many people that I know I sound so redundant right now, just dehumanize and, you know, profit off of Black people's deaths and brown people's like deaths and execution. Like they profit by winning the campaign or profit by like selling T-shirts with their names on them or it just doesn't feel right at all.
No, I think that, you know, well, one, redundancy is often good, especially when the point is so important, because I think what you're saying about the dehumanization is true. I mean, I know I said this before, so I'll be redundant too, but I feel people are not really factoring in the fact that, okay, well, they're saying they were serving a warrant, but if you are served a warrant, that actually does not mean that you've done anything. It just means that they are accusing you of doing something. But whatever they are accusing you of doing, I thought you were supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. You're supposed to be brought to court. They're supposed to do all these other things. But then they're going to roll on somebody with a military unit, and then people think, oh, well, he must have done something. It must be some level of guilt or whatever. But it's like, no, this is not it. But exactly what you say, Alana, that dehumanization, that's what people immediately jump to. Well, who was he? What was he doing?
Right. And I also want to add that with being like boots on the ground and everything, a lot of the police are actually issuing secret warrants for people. So if you are protesting and everything, you may be on the street and you might have a warrant out for your arrest and everything. And you wouldn't know unless you call the magistrate office and you say, hey, do I have a warrant for my arrest? And it's like, it's insane that it's going to this level just to try and pick people off of the streets to reclaim their streets, which actually don't belong to them in the first place. It belongs to colonized people. But that's another discussion.
No, but it's a very relevant one. And I mean, you know, the way the police act, you'd think that they owned everything. And I mean, it just goes back to Rana's point as well, which is about sort of like, you know, the idea that somehow you're the ruler as opposed to the servant. But let me also ask you this, Alana. Where is the movement going in Elizabeth City next? What are people planning? What are folks working on? I know you're not going away. What should people expect over the next few days? Or I don't know, next few days, next however long.
Me and a few of like trusted comrades and everything, we are actually trying to put together like a refunding of the police. And we're trying to reallocate the funds from the like policing system, like because we have the budget in place and everything, looking at it. And we're trying to redistribute that to not the policing sources, but more of the community needs. So affordable housing and playgrounds in, you know, like marginalized communities. Clean water would be nice. And these are just big goals that we have, but they're also very attainable and very necessary for humanity in general.
Just to pick up on something you just said, that's interesting. Clean water definitely would be nice. Is there a challenge with clean water there in Elizabeth City?
Well, not as much as Flint. Nowhere near.
I mean,
But
that
there is
shouldn't, right?
still,
But
like,
of course, Flint
crazy.
shouldn't be the standard. But yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's funny
yeah.
that's you're like that. Well, not as much as Flint, but
No,
I mean,
our water isn't brown or anything, but I mean,
right.
honestly, sometimes like when I first moved into this house and everything, I clearly have natural hair, so my hair needs specific needs and everything. When I first moved in, my hair just felt so dry, and it was just so many like crazy things just in the water and everything. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hidden crisis in America. That's why, thank you for
yeah.
asking that. I think people have no idea everywhere. So many
Oh, I
places.
mean,
there's so much
there was like
poison.
an AP did like a study. I don't remember the exact number, but they found like there's hundreds and hundreds of towns across America that have water as bad or worse than Flint, Michigan.
Yeah,
So
USA Today,
I
5
mean, that's
million
something to chew
people.
on right there.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
Well, Alana, I really appreciate you joining us. Really appreciate all your work there in Elizabeth City. We will definitely keep checking back in with you about everything that is going there and your movement to get justice and to change policing there in North Carolina.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Of course, pleasure was all ours. Well, Rania, this is, I mean, it's such a ridiculous issue that we have to constantly talk about this. I mean, I think that in every show we've done almost, other than perhaps some of the particular issues around Palestine, I think almost every Freedom Side we've done together, the murder of an innocent person by the police in the United States has been a factor. And I think another area where we're seeing quite a bit of police brutality and police violence is Colombia, where there is an ongoing uprising there. I think we might be entering 3 weeks now, just being brutally repressed, but despite that, continuing to stay on the streets. So we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Cathy Rojas, who is an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and by Zoe Alexandra, who is a journalist with People's Dispatch. Back with us again. Cathy, Zoe, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Cathy, I'll start with you. I don't know, seems like maybe a terrible question, but as a Colombian, you're here in the United States, and you've been active in solidarity here, you have family there, you travel back and forth. What has it been like seeing this movement over the past few weeks?
Oh man, I mean, I wasn't expecting that question, but it's just, I mean, it's been heartbreaking. My family is from Cali, and to see my little cousins like put their life on the line every day is something incredibly worrisome. But at the same time, I think that it's something that is needed, and I can commend their courage. I think due to U.S. funding, Colombia has been one of the most violent countries in the world when it comes to killing social leaders and human rights leaders. It has one of the greatest inequalities in Latin America in terms of income inequalities. And I mean, what we're seeing right now, especially for a Colombian American, is just like every single day waking up to videos of people being killed by police. Every single day waking up to videos of people that have lost their arms, lost their eyes because of police violence. Every single day worrying whether my family is okay. That's what it's been like. And every single day having to watch the videos and share them because of media censorship. Right now, when Colombians do try to post on Facebook, it's taken off. Sometimes even they've tried to send videos to me on WhatsApp, and they're not allowed to. Like, it won't let them send that particular video. When they go on live, they send me the live so that I could share it in the US. And when I try to share that live, like when I try to go to the live, it's like if the live doesn't even exist. So we see how American media companies like Facebook and Instagram are working together to really censor our people and censor the human rights violations that are going on in the country. It's completely nerve-wracking. And, really, I really commend all the protesters, La Primera Línea, the front lines that are really, really holding it down every night, making sure that the national strike continues until there are negotiations that truly change the conditions of working class people in the country.
Well, let me ask you this as a follow-up, because does this feel to you like a turning point? I mean, obviously social struggle is nothing new in Colombia, but it just feels like no matter what the government is doing, they can't put out this fire of resistance. Is this a bigger turning point for the, or not maybe a bigger, but a turning point for the country and the struggle against the right wing there?
Definitely, 100%. I think that after the peace process that happened in 2016, I think that before the peace process, for many, many years, the Colombian government had blamed all of its violence and all of its problems on the FARC-EP and the guerrilla forces, even though 80% of all murders that happened in Colombia were done by the right-wing paramilitary. And I think that they excused all of this violence and things on the left wing and on guerrilla forces. And what we see after 2016 is that they've been dismantled, and what happens? State repression has continued. It has actually only gone up due to COVID-19. We saw that social leaders were, they had to quarantine, and that the paramilitary was using this quarantine as a way to find people in their house and kill them. And I think that people became very present to, wow, this isn't the guerrilla as we were being told. This is actually the state that has been killing us. And we also saw in COVID-19 how little the country took care of the people, how little resources it provided. My father was just there because he went to visit my grandmother. He paid $150 for a COVID exam. Wow. And this is not pesos, this is dollars. I mean, that's a lot for me. You know what I mean? As an American, as a teacher, like, it's just, so then they say like, oh, we don't have high COVID rates. It's like, yes, because nobody could get tested. So I think that people really, the new generation, because it's really the youth that have really woken up to the reality of the country, and that are no longer going to remain silent, that are brave and courageous and really putting their life on the line, because they refuse to continue to allow Colombia to be a puppet of the US and for corporations to continue to exploit them and their lands.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are watching the Freedom Side here on Breakthrough News. If you're just joining, we're talking to Cathy Rojas, an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and Zoe Alexandra, a journalist with People's Dispatch, here about the ongoing uprising in Colombia. And Zoe, to pick up on something that Cathy was talking about in terms of the media, I mean, we were just talking about this earlier today, the level of just police terrorism going on, which is not filtering into what we're hearing. I mean, in general, Colombia has been sort of taken out of the headlines here in the Western media, but even to the extent it is, a lot of it that I've seen is actually just talking about how Duque wants to negotiate, president of Colombia, which is ridiculous, but that this huge amount of repression that's happening is just being whitewashed by so much of the media in Latin America and here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to grasp the levels of repression that we're seeing. Even it's impossible to know, even because human rights organizations are being shot at. The Inter-American Human Rights Commission is not allowed in the country to do a verification. And so even the numbers that we have are incomplete. But at least we're talking about 50 people assassinated by police forces, with maybe some 10 killed by, armed civilians, which are, watched over by the police forces. We're looking at, over 1,000 people who have been arbitrarily detained. And in some of those cases, we've heard numerous reports of people being sexually assaulted by police. I mean, it's horrifying, the reports that are coming out. I just read one yesterday that, people were brought to a jail and made to undress. And, it's really like hard to get a grasp on the levels that are happening, because it's not only protests in one city, it's protests across the country. And across the country, we're seeing these levels. And there are also hundreds of disappeared people who have been, detained, brought to undisclosed locations. And in the past week, I think especially Cathy has probably seen this because it's happening a lot in Cali. There have been bodies that have been turning up in the river, and it's really hard to know what's happening, what's real, because there are no verification teams on the ground. There were reports that a supermarket was used as a torture and detention center, and that there was just people locked in there for hours being abused, and there's no, and there, you know, they had time to, you know, try to clean the floors. I mean, it's really horrifying because there is no way to tell what's happening. And then the people who are going out and trying to do this work, I mean, there's really incredible human rights organizations. And, you know, when we say human rights organizations in the US, we get an idea of like NGOs, but in Colombia, they're like, you know, these really incredible lawyers, student leaders who go in with these, you know, with the vests, and they're, you know, speaking to police, telling them to release protesters, trying to verify, trying to get their name, their ID number. Every time someone's arrested, you know, you see the human rights people running after them to get their information to make sure that they're not disappeared, because that's the reality. And, you know, unfortunately, that's what's been happening.
So just to remind people, we are I just wanted to remind everyone we're speaking to Cathy Rojas, organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and Zoe Alexandra, journalist and co-editor of the People's Dispatch. I wanted to jump in with a question real quick for both of you, because I think it's important, all of these things that we're hearing about what's happening on the ground, but it's also important to recognize the role of the U.S., because the U.S. is a huge backer of the Colombian government, the Colombian military, the Colombian police. So can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, let's start with you, Zoe. Can you talk a little bit about the role that the U.S. plays in working with Colombia in the region and arming the police and the military that makes this possible?
Well, the relationship with Colombia and the United States is historic. It goes back decades. And currently, the foreign minister and vice president is meeting with several high-level members of the U.S. government. She already has met with the Organization of American States, with Luis Almagro. And, you know, the U.S. in this context has not made any, you know, strong statements or trying to pressure Colombia to stop this repression. So I think that's pretty telling. And then, you know, historically, of course, we can look at 2000 Plan Colombia, massive economic and military aid package that essentially, you know, gave technical training to Colombia's military to effectively, which they weren't able to, but wipe out the guerrilla groups, which was, you know, marketed as their aid package to help the war against drugs. And of course, as I think we've said it in different breakthrough news shows, but I mean, Colombia is the Israel of Latin America. So it's strategically necessary. It's necessary for them to have you know, a conservative government, a government that's going to suppress any possible left-wing movement that will actually arrive to power. Because if there's regional cooperation between Venezuela and Colombia, if there's any, you know, possibility that they don't have that strategic military base, because Colombia is one of the countries with the most U.S. military bases in the world, then they lose a massive, you know, point of power.
And somehow a lot of drug trafficking too. Isn't that funny? Wherever we've talked about this before too, but wherever the U.S. Seems to have the most like presence, also ends up with the most drug trafficking. I'm sorry, Cathy. I feel like I cut you off. You were going to say something before. Go ahead, please.
Well, I just want to add really quickly, the relationship between Colombia and the United States. Yes, it obviously evolved a lot during the Plan Colombia of 2001 that Clinton implemented, that sent $9 billion to Colombia to militarize Colombia. Since then, we've seen 10,000 social leaders that have been killed and a rise in the drug trade. But actually, since 1962, after the Cuban Revolution, the CIA was actually sent to Colombia under a plan called Plan Lasso. And William Yarborough, who was a CIA agent, specifically requested that there begin to be civilian and military personnel for clandestine training in resistance operations in case they are needed later. This should be done with a view towards development of the civil and military structure. And he goes on to say, in order to go against terrorist activities and known communist proponents. And we know that socialism and communism really means protecting workers' rights. So the United States has been funding and helping paramilitaries in Colombia for many, many, many years. The one thing that I did want to say that was mentioned before is about the disappearances. There's over 900 Colombian activists that have been disappeared. Now, being disappeared is very strategic because if you are killed, there's a story to the body. You were either shot, you were tortured. People know what happened to you. If you're disappeared, there is no investigation. Nobody knows what happened to you unless maybe somebody got a video and and you said your name right before you were taken away. So really, and as we saw, like I think it was 34 people that were killed within like the first 4 to 5 days of protest, and we saw protests erupt all throughout the world for Colombia. And now we see them a little bit dying down because we don't see as many official deaths, but the same number of disappearances. And that's something that the Colombia has used strategically for many, many, many years. The other thing that I was going to say about the media and the way that they move or manipulate things, I wanted to use a very specific example in Cali when La Minga Indígena, which is an indigenous group that came from the southern Valle del Cauca, southern Cauca, and they came up to help the people of Cali in their strike because they have much more experience, right? When they came in with their chivas, which means their buses, Ciudad Jardín, which is the richest part of Cali, also the whitest part of Cali. Cali is also known to not be a white city. They began shooting at them. When they begin to shoot at them, the press, obviously indigenous peoples defended themselves. And the way that the press reported on it is they said, oh, citizens of Cali are fighting against the attacks of indigenous people. Now, to put this into perspective, this is like if in New York, we all revolted against police brutality, and then indigenous peoples came to help us from upstate, and then people in the Upper East Side ended up taking up arms and going against the indigenous peoples, and they say New Yorkers are are revolting against the indigenous peoples. It absolutely makes no sense, and they have been manipulating the narrative this whole time. And I wanted to say something about the supermarket Éxito. My family has confirmed that to me. They live near the supermarket, and there was for many days yelling. And even videos that they sent me where you can hear the yelling, the shootings that were happening in Éxito, and when they were taking in protesters into Éxito in order to torture them. So that was definitely happening.
Wow. I mean, you don't even know what to say about some of the things. One thing I wanted to quickly pick up on, Cathy, is talk a little bit about what has been happening in the diaspora. I mean, I know we're here in New York. There's been a number of protests. People have been standing up. What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very, very, very important, whether there's many ways to stand up. And I think the number one thing that we have to be calling for is the end of U.S. military aid to Colombia. Because ESMAD was actually started by the U.S., okay? They trained their first 30,000 soldiers. So we know that without this funding, they cannot continue to do what they're doing. But also the weapons that they're using, U.S. weapons, even some bullets that they found that they sent me pictures of were the same bullets that Israel's using against Palestinians. So it's very interesting to see how things are interconnected. But all of us who are abroad, and anybody else who's in solidarity with Colombia, the first thing that we need to be calling for is the end of U.S. imperialism in Colombia, because we need to understand that the reason why this tax reform it wasn't changed so quickly is because taxing corporations would go against the United States interest in the country, whether that's Monsanto, whether that's Chiquita Banana, whether it's Accidental Petroleum. All of these companies have something to lose with being taxed. All of these companies have something to lose with the workers' wages going up. So that's something that we need to be calling for. Other than that, we need to be sharing people's videos. Right now, like I said, there is a whole media blackout about what's going on. I see it myself. My family posts up videos on Facebook, and I have to screen record it because within an hour or two, it'll be taken down from Facebook or Instagram. We need to be sharing that. We need to also we need to be sending money. You know, at the end of the day, things are costing a lot right now. One of the things that happened during El Paro or the national strike is that obviously they're not allowing any merchandise to come into the cities. Now the government is blaming them, and they're like, oh, well, you're not letting food come into the city, so you're letting people starve. Let me tell you, in Pasaje Cali, they did a deal with the city so that they could allow food to come in. You know what the city brought in? They opened the trucks. It was full of tires, merchandise, clothing, and shoes for the rich of Cali to sell in their stores. Okay, so they're trying to blame the protesters, but the protesters said, you want to bring in food? Bring in food, but only food, nothing for the capitalists, and they don't. So food prices are going up a lot. So we do need to be sending money because they do need American dollars in order to buy their food at the moment. There's a lot of organizations that are sending funds. I'm personally sending funds to some organizers that I know in Buenaventura and Cali. Yes, but the main thing is to be fighting against U.S. imperialism, to be protesting and demanding that the U.S. and their military funding is removed from Colombia.
Yeah, well, Zoe, I think what Cathy is saying is so crucial. I mean, we see the role of the United States, the level of whitewashing. I mean, I think it was just 2 weeks ago that Ivan Duque was being honored at New York University at NYU. And I'm constantly seeing these American media stories that are like, well, you know, it's two sides, you know, but they're negotiating. The president looks like he wants to negotiate there. I mean, it's such a perverse reality, but it does affect, I think, how people here may or may not see the situation.
For sure. I mean, this is historic. There have been, you know, over the past decades, so many popular mobilizations in Colombia where protesters have demanded to meet with the national government and have very strong demands. I think what we see in this strike is a continuation of these historic demands, the fulfillment of the Havana peace agreements, you know, the respect to other agreements the government has made with organizations from the countryside, from the cities, a demilitarization of life in general, because, you know, of course, we're seeing an increased level of militarization of the cities, of the countryside, but this is a constant in Colombia. It's a country where the military is at war against its people. And, you know, Duque is, you know, saying that he's trying to negotiate, and it's just the vandals and the criminals, and if only they stop their road blockades, then, you know, we could get somewhere. But they're night after night, they've shown that they actually have no will to negotiate, because one of the key demands is that the repression end, is that there be the guarantee to safe protests, that people can, you know, protest without being worried that they're going to turn up the next day dead or arrested or disappeared or you know, that is a basic human right, that they should be able to protest, and that is not being guaranteed by the government. So how can you even negotiate when the government isn't protecting people's lives? And of course, the U.S. media is, you know, hiding that fact.
Well, I'll just ask you this follow-up, Zoe, but I want both your thoughts on this. I mean, the other element of it, and we're seeing some of this in the images next to us on the screen right now that I think is so amazing, is not just the resistance in and of itself, but is the level of culture, spirit, joy, hope that infuses these protests. I mean, it's really, in the face of everything we're seeing in terms of police brutality, amazing. I mean, talk about that protest culture a little bit, if you will, Zoe, because I think that's an important piece of it.
Yeah, I think this is truly remarkable. And, you know, tomorrow is the 29th, 28th, and that will mark exactly 1 month since the strike has started. And I think we saw it on the first day, April 28th, you know, this incredible dance of these people in the Plaza Bolivar, and that's just continued, like the culture, the resistance. And I think this is a really key element, because it's not just about, you know, being on the streets and protesting against the government, but it's about, you know, creating this new world, about creating the new culture that's outside of this culture of paramilitarism, of, you know, the Colombia that's always portrayed as a Colombia of violence, of drug trafficking, that the US, of course, loves this narrative. But it's a, you know, and there's, of course, many organizations who have been actively organizing in this strike that have been building this people's culture that's counter to this hegemonic culture. And I think we're seeing that now, and it's really something. And I think it's what keeps people on the streets, is what keeps people motivated. And we can't just show the pictures of the protests of people getting repressed, but we also must be sharing these beautiful images of people in resistance.
Yeah. Cathy, your thoughts on the same question?
I mean, I absolutely love my people and love my culture. If you ever go, well, actually, it's pretty funny, but so there was a big protest in Times Square, and there was a ton of, I'm talking about, I've never seen so many Colombians out for something political. And this was like the third day after the national strike. And everybody's like happy and dancing and all this. I was a little uncomfortable because I'm like, this is a protest. Like, we're supposed to be protesting, you know what I mean? But what I came to the conclusion about that is that our people were very happy people. And the people that were protesting in the national strike, every day they were going out singing, chanting, dancing. They were making sancochos for the people, all of these things. And it is only when the police become violent with us, and when they try to repress us, and when they try to repress Colombian protesters, that Colombian protesters must defend themselves, and that culture has to shift because it's a culture of fear. But naturally, we are, you know, we're happy, celebratory people in terms of Cali. We're coastal people. We're closer to the Pacific coast, and we want to do everything out of love for our land, out of love for our community, out of love for our people, for our families, and everything that we do is out of love. And it's only until the U.S., the U.S., because the military is funded by the U.S., brings in the hate, the repression, that we really see, that energy shift.
And you are watching Breakthrough News. This is the Freedom Side. I'm Eugene Puryear. I'm here alongside Rana Houston. We are continuing to be joined by Cathy Rojas, an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Also, Zoe Alexandra, who is a journalist with People's Dispatch. And I guess maybe just to turn it forward a little bit here, Cathy, I'll ask you this next question, but I also want to know both your thoughts on this. I mean, where do things go from here? I mean, obviously, the government seems totally intransigent. They want to make zero concessions. I know it's hard to predict in a way. This is sort of a loaded question, but where do you see things going from here? Do you see it intensifying, receding?
Well, we're going into 1 month tomorrow of the national strike. Honestly, I see a lot of hope in the people from when I speak to my family, when I speak to obviously my younger cousins are much more determined to stay out in the streets, and my aunts and uncles are worried more so than anything else. But I see a lot of determination. And I think that at the end of the day, the front line, what they're saying is we need to make sure that after we have this agreement, we're still alive. Because if we see from the FARC, right, the FARC had their peace agreement. And soon after that, over 300 of them have been killed. In the 1990 to 1994 peace agreements that happened in Colombia, they created a legal party that was called La Unión Patriótica. There was a genocide of that political party. It's a range between 3,000 to 5,000 of those political party members that were assassinated in Colombia. So I think that a main question right now is security. How are we going to secure the protesters that are on the front lines? And we also have to, they have to concede to their demands. They have to raise the minimum wage. They have to ensure that they have free education. They have to do, they have to hold the police accountable, right? What happened to the police officer? There was a police officer in Popayan that kidnapped a young girl, and Alison Melendez is her name. They kidnapped her. They took her into a police precinct. She was raped. She came out. She wrote a post on Facebook talking about her rape. The next day, she committed suicide. and they investigated that, and they said that nobody was at fault for her suicide. They did not arrest not one police officer. What is going to happen with all of the people that have been killed, that have lost their eyes, that are disappeared? Who is going to be held accountable? And I think that the struggle continues, and that Colombian people, we had one of the longest civil wars in the world. There's nobody that has I'm lying. Everybody has a big heart, but we have a lot of heart. We have a lot of heart. We have a lot of passion, and la lucha sigue.
Mm-hmm. Zoe?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in a general sense, there's a shift in terms of the political spectrum as well. This week, there was a vote in the Senate and the House of Representatives on whether to motion of censure of the defense minister, Diego Molano, who in Colombia, the police and the army are both under the Ministry of Defense. So he has kind of been identified as movements as the person who's responsible for the repression, for the deaths of protesters, et cetera. And so there was a motion moved, which failed in the Senate today. There was, 66 votes against, of course, by the usual suspects, the members of Álvaro Uribe's party, Centro Democrático, and a lot of other of his far-right allies, large landowners, people associated with the oligarchs in the country. But there's a small group of legislators who are from who are now part of the historic pact, and that in the upcoming elections, they stand quite a good chance to win a majority in the Congress. And of course, the presidential candidate for this historic pact, Gustavo Petro, is coming in pretty strong in all of the polls. There's been also this effort by Duque to say that everything that's happening on the streets is because of Gustavo Petro, and it's all, an electoral game to try to, better his chances in the polls, which is of course ridiculous because the people are on the streets for so many more reasons. But I think that's also a really important thing to point out. And yesterday, a member of the Liberal Party, and of course in Colombia, the Liberal Party is one of the parties that was part of, this pact between oligarchs to make sure that the people didn't ever get power. It's not in the sense a progressive party at all. He makes a public statement on Twitter saying that I'm sorry for the actions of my party. I'm sorry I didn't see that the country was in crisis before. I know that 21 million people are in poverty now, but that's not just because of COVID. He does this whole speech. He calls it a mea culpa. And I think it's a sign that, the tides are changing. The fear is no longer there. They know they can't play the politics of scaring people into submission, into scaring them to vote for voting for the far right, and that people are seeing that they have power and that the alternative proposal is there, and they've already, been able to defeat the tax reform law. They defeated the reform to the health law. They already, forced the resignation of the finance minister. The foreign minister already resigned, and they're seeing real change happening from people being on the street, pressuring people in Congress to take action. And I think that's going to, whether or not, how many more weeks these protests will continue, I think we will see several more weeks of mobilizations, especially in the rural areas where, they have the supplies to be able to maintain these kind of road blockades, hopefully in the city as well. But I think we're going to see this turn into organization. We see, across big cities, people are not holding road blockades maybe in the centers of the city, but in the neighborhoods, taking over the transportation terminals. So people are organizing at levels that, of course, Colombia, there's so many social organizations, social movements, but people are organizing even more. And so that's going to turn into more organized people, more workers' power, more people's power. And then I think we're really going to see an interesting election next year. Well, it's unclear what's going to, transpire from here to now. It's Colombia, kind of anything can happen, but I think it's positive.
No, it's certainly notable. I mean, it's a very, very different social context, but it reminds me a little bit of Mexico just before AMLO was elected, where it's anything can happen. The possibility of massacres, stolen elections is there. But it was such a foregrounding. I was there just for the election, and some of what I've seen in Colombia reminds me of this, of how much the right-wing politics really is a politics of hate and rejection. Someone sent me a photo the other day from Duque's last campaign, some big billboard which was like, vote for Duque, we're not Venezuela. I'm just paraphrasing there. I mean, you look at the Semana attack on Gustavo Petro, displaying him as the Terminator, and that's all they have though, really. There's no positive go forward politics. It's just the politics of hate, of division, and that can seem so hollow when there's really a movement on the streets, Cathy.
Yeah, I mean, even I mean those memes, like every day we're seeing on the media, they won't report on the repression, but they'll say, oh, this is Petro who's paying. They even go so far as to say that he himself is paying protesters to be out in the streets. But I think that one thing that really shifted with this, I will say, is that a lot of the repression that had happened in Colombia in the past had been in very rural areas, like in El Campo and in Tumaco and places like this. And this is, for a long time, we hadn't seen protests like this in cities. And I think that a lot of people have been displaced from rural areas and now live in cities. And I think that people are beginning to open their eyes. I mean, like my family, they were always left-leaning, but they didn't distrust media. They didn't have this massive distrust of media. Now they're really like, no, like we see them killing people, and then we see them take out this article completely lying about it. Like, I've talked to my aunt that is like, how could they lie so much? How could they deny that they are killing people when we're seeing it with our own eyes? And I think that that's really the determining factor right now, that before they kind of had this repression in El Campo, in rural areas, very hidden from the cities and from a lot of Colombians. And now it's in everybody's face, and everybody is realizing that the media is lying. The media lies because it wants to protect the wealthy. And I think another big shift is the fact that a lot of the people that are organizing are young people that didn't grow up watching Caracol and RCN, which are like the news like reporting sites that our parents watched, because we had social media. And we watch Twitter and lives, and we watch people, people's stories that are on the ground. And we no longer depend on mass media. And I think that has really created a shift, and they have tried so hard to take away support from Petro, and they're failing so badly. It's laughable.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of mass media, I just want to say, where is Jorge Ramos? Someone gets a hangnail in Venezuela, and he's in the Miraflores Palace. Where is he? I mean,
yes, and
unbelievable.
My mother loves him. My mother loved him, and then and then I told her, I was like, "Where's Jorge Ramos?" Because she would tell, she would show me. I'm not impartial about Venezuela. I know where I stand, and she would show me him, and she's like, "Well, he's impartial," and I'm like, "No, ma, that's not impartial. He is employed by a capitalist media outlet. He has an agenda," and she would argue with me that he was impartial. And then I'm like, if he's so impartial, why isn't he reporting about this? And then she's like, you know what? You're right. And it's really coming to light who really has the interest of the people. Even Colombian artists, right? We saw Maluma that put up who's a Colombian reggaetonero that everybody loves. He put up a poll saying, should we continue talking about the same old politics, or should I take out my new album? And all of the Colombian people were like, we're going to continue talking about the same old politics on his Instagram poll. And now they don't mess with him. They don't want to have anything to do with him. I mean, it's crazy. There's actually this other actress, Alejandra Azcárate, that she's very well known in Colombia. and she has been posting things saying, I wonder when people are going to start marching peacefully, but to work, and saying, you know, I don't march, I work. And 2 days ago, her husband's plane was caught with 400 kilos of cocaine. So they begin to,
Jesus.
and I'm like, you don't work, you're a narco trafficker. And we begin to see like these, the ties, like it's just like before it wasn't reported on, but then it got reported on Twitter.
In narco trafficking, but she's not the one doing the work.
No,
right?
But it got reported on Twitter and everybody knows it now. And everybody's like, wait, the rich don't actually work. Oh, she supported Uribe because Uribe is a narco trafficker himself that had ties to Pablo Escobar. Yep. And, you know, and I think everything's becoming much more apparent now that the working class are able to also be news reporters themselves and tell their own stories.
That's right. Well, I really, really, really appreciate you both joining us here. I don't know, Zoe, you look like there's one thing you might want to say.
Well, I did want to add one thing because we're talking about media, and I can't let the topic go without just bringing up an incident that happened yesterday in the south of Bogota, just to kind of bring it back to the repression and the role of alternative media. You know, my comrades at Colombia Informa, that's where I started being a reporter, were attacked by the police. They were covering, you know, the very brutal repression that was happening. And, you know, we've seen, as Cathy mentioned, the, you know, citizen journalists, youth journalists who are on the streets recording stuff, making sure that the word gets out about what's happening. Colombia Informa has been, you know, in the front lines doing this work for the past month and, you know, of course, the past 10 years as well. And yesterday, the police, essentially, he was following after, the reporter was following after someone who got injured, and the police just came over to him, started harassing him, asking him if he was a thief, a robber, a vandal, a criminal, saying that he was gay, calling him slang words. And, you know, this is the treatment of media that wants to reveal what's happening to the people. So I think it's really key that we support, you know, the alternative media projects in Colombia that are on the streets doing this incredibly brave work, risking their lives and making sure that the truth about what's happening gets out. So just want to give that shout out to Colombia Informa and all the amazing journalists who are on the ground every single day, every single night, you know, getting tear gas, getting beaten by the police. You know, Colombia Informa also got shot at with rubber bullets by the police. So just gotta can't let that slip by.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. And you all at the People's Dispatch have been doing an excellent job as well, covering the events.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you both joining us. Zoe Alexandra from People's Dispatch. By the way, 11 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. Give the people what they want. Great show from People's Dispatch. Zoe is one of the hosts. Definitely check that out. Cathy Rojas, organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Thank you so much for being with us here on the show. Really, thank you both for giving us your time here this evening on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rana, I feel like we've hit so many different stories now, but there are a lot of themes here. Also, just want to mention, of course, I'm Eugene Puryear, alongside the birthday girl, Rania Khalek, here hosting on the Freedom Side live here on Breakthrough News. Happy birthday again for everyone who is just joining. Well, for you. But so everyone who's just joining is aware that it's your birthday.
And just a reminder to those who are watching, you can always throw money in the super chat and we will shout you out. Furthermore, if you do want to support our work on top of the live streams that we do every week for the Freedom Side on Thursday evenings, Eastern Time, you can also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/breakthrough news. We also do a ton of reporting. I have my show Dispatches. Eugene's got the Punch Out. We do on the ground reporting, so much happening at Breakthrough News. We've got On the Picket Line with Monica Cruz, one of the only labor reporters in the country. So just keep that in mind as you're watching along, that you can support the show that way. And I think now's a great time to bring in our next guest. We opened talking about Palestine, and now we're bringing it back to Palestine because obviously this is still a very important story despite the ceasefire. So I'm very pleased to welcome back to Breakthrough News As'ad AbuKhalil. He's the professor at California State University. As'ad, thank you so much for coming back on. It's so good to have you.
Absolutely, and very happy birthday to you, Rania.
Thank Thank you. I appreciate that. I really just want to get
course.
into it because so much has happened since we talked last. We had you on during one of our live streams during the war on Gaza. And so now that that war has come to a sort of end, obviously Gaza is still under siege. Palestinians are still under attack, but the bombs have stopped falling for now. But looking back on the battle, now that some time has gone by, how do you assess the results? I mean, was it tactically, I guess, prudent for Hamas to intervene? Do you think they scored a victory? If so, why? And will Israel think twice before a provocative action like the one that started this recent round of bombing?
Well, as you know, the mainstream media is now occupied with Belarus because they find what happened with Belarus is far more outrageous and more bloody than what actually happened to 66 Palestinian children in Gaza. But I think you're right. It is time, as the dust settles, to ask the pertinent questions regarding the outcome of the war and what kind of lessons we think the enemy, that is Israel, will draw for the future. And I think it's fair to say that the potential of any Israeli provocation in Lebanon have been minimized substantially by what happened. I mean, I'm sure every Israeli officer and soldier is thinking, if this is what Hamas could inflict on us, just imagine what Hezbollah can paralyze the whole country for months on end. So clearly, the outcome is not to the liking of the Israelis. In fact, if anything, it is increasingly exposing the inability of Israel to return to its founding military doctrine. I mean, its founding military doctrine was based on the ability to inflict large amount of mass violence in as much time as they want, and provided it can achieve quick results, and the ability to overwhelm the military forces of the other side and to intimidate them into submission. I mean, that was tried on Arab armies successfully in the 1940s and 50s and beyond, and clearly this has not been working. I mean, what happened in the July War of 2006 was the beginning of the end of the Israeli founding military strategic doctrine. What they have to contend with is basically that the enemy, these are volunteers. People, I mean, we should remind the listeners and the viewers that we're talking about Palestinian and Lebanese volunteers who have humiliated repeatedly the Israeli army on the battlefield, humiliated them more than once. And with that, we can say it is the Israelis who are far more scared of the enemy than the other way around. And that has going to have tremendous repercussions. And I think this is also, it's extremely significant, a lesson to draw by the allies of Israel in the Arab world, right? The UAE and Saudi Arabia and those, because those were rushing to align themselves with an Israel that had a stellar reputation as far as military decisive action is concerned. And now we see these impoverished Palestinians in Gaza were able to paralyze this mighty state that is occupation state that is founded and sitting on a massive nuclear arsenal. That is tremendously significant. But I think also Israel has to worry about the slipping, not only reputation of Israel as a victorious country, but also its reputation around the world, even in the most sympathetic quarters, and that would be here in the United States. I mean, what we have seen basically is that individuals, people like us and many others around the world, were able to wrestle the narrative out of the dominant Zionist media. I mean, Zionist organizations for too many decades were able to enter into sinister secret negotiations with the publisher of the New York Times, the publisher of the Washington Post, the head of CBS, NBC, and so on, so that they basically ban and prevent any counter point of view that does not represent the Israeli military's interests. That is not possible anymore. And there is a slippage in that ability. And of course, they will try. I mean, we know that ADL is entering into negotiation and they coordinate with the big tech companies like Facebook, which is basically censoring right and left all pro-Palestinian voices. I myself was expelled permanently from Facebook, among many others, of course. And yet, they still cannot control the narrative. Individuals, largely Palestinians under occupation, were able to decide the narrative. And we have seen, and this is one of the first times I can see that, Rania, since I came to this country, the enemy was on the defensive. The Israeli propagandists were on the defensive. They could not catch up. And I just saw a report by Israel's National Security Agency or something of that sort, a think tank in Israel, which basically did a study, and they're saying we lost the social media war. And that is very significant. So Israel cannot shape the propaganda. I mean, sure, the military censor of Israel can order the meek, subservient Western correspondents in the Middle East to basically toe the line. They can order them not to publish this picture, not to air this report. They can order them to go now with the flash that Israel's army is about to invade Gaza, which you know was a total lie. And of course, Western journalists were more than willing, were relishing the opportunity to serve the Israeli army. All that, with all these services, the mainstream media could not catch up. People, individuals, free individuals on social media ran with the story and exposed the brutality of the Israeli state. This is not to say that we are not contending with a very powerful enemy. And the powerful enemy has tremendous allies here in the United States. And we have seen how the mainstream liberal media were totally misleading the public about Joe Biden being a man of peace, being an alternative to Donald Trump. And those of us on the radical left, who questioned all this narrative throughout the election, we have been validated. We have seen that Joe Biden is in fact a better representative of the war empire than Donald Trump. And he will be taking this country into more wars, continuing more wars, and most importantly, giving a blank check to the Israeli war machine under the most offensive line that all that falls under self-defense. You can kill as many Palestinian children. Joe Biden will consider that self-defense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to the point you were making about the media. I think another reason that you have this change as well is because the Israeli side is just becoming so toxic to watch. I mean, I saw you tweeting about this earlier. There's this guy in Sheikh Jarrah, this Israeli settler with a very American accent. I think he's like from Long Island or something. Yaqub, who just like keeps like giving. I mean, he just put him on camera. All you need to do is put this guy on camera, and he's insane. He's just this crazy religious zealot. What is that? He said they made a meme out of him being like, if I don't steal it, someone else will.
Exactly.
So I think that's an interesting.
You should have him on the show, by the way.
Yeah, actually, we should invite him on Breakthrough. But I think it's interesting. I think Israel's becoming too hard. It's becoming too difficult to make Israel look good because it's the really far right crazies have really taken over the politics there. But I want to ask you about the regional response. I don't know, I assume you've probably been following to some degree the regional response. Is Palestine back on the Arab agenda? Did it ever leave, right? Or were we simply, I guess, distracted perhaps by the Arab Spring and ISIS and all these sectarian wars that kind of took over the Middle East for the last 10 years, but have now passed, and now Palestine seems to be recentered as the cause. Would you agree with that?
You're absolutely right, Rani. You're absolutely right. And I have followed very closely how the Palestine issue in the last 2 weeks have been followed in the Arab media. I mean, you know Lebanon well enough to know how many of these journalists and media are run and owned and dictated by either European countries, George Soros, the United States, or Gulf regimes. Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar in particular, but largely Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They are the ones who run the agenda. And they were taken aback. They were taken aback, one, that the Israelis are going to be unrestrained in their ability to inflict mass violence on the Palestinian population. And that's going to embarrass these allies of Israel in the Arab world. And second, they were really taken aback by the extent to which all Arabs throughout the countries were rallying for Palestine. I mean, the first 2 days were extremely significant because we saw the number one hashtag in UAE and Saudi Arabia where Palestine is my number one cause. And that was very embarrassing to the normalizing regimes, especially those two. And the next day, Mohammed bin Salman MBS unleashed his sleazy electronic army, and they went about with a new message that Palestine is my cause. I mean, of course, everybody knew these were the army of Mohammed bin Salman. It doesn't reflect Saudi public opinion and so on. So yes, there was tremendous rallying support. And most importantly, Rani, I mean, again, to take you back to Lebanon, where you know enough, I mean, you find in Lebanon, even media organizations funded by Europeans or Gulfies, that were so embarrassed about the depth of people's attachment to Palestine that they started riding the wave. I mean, you saw an outfit like Megaphone trying to pretend that they are pro-Palestinian, even though, if you notice, they only spoke about Jerusalem, as if there was nothing happening in Gaza, because the story of Gaza is too embarrassing for organizations that are run by Europeans or by Gulfies because they don't want to champion resistance. They are fundamentally, viscerally opposed to the principle and practice of resistance. So I think that many Arab governments are now going back to the drawing board, not to change their policies, but to be aware that Arab public opinion is not being changed by the glitzy media of Gulf countries. They still feel tremendous attachment to the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, and you mentioned Megaphone News. It's funded by the EU Endowment for Democracy, which is like the EU version of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is, of course, the regime change arm of the US when it comes to civil society and funding media. But you mentioned, these Gulf countries. I thought it was really interesting, from a regional perspective. The normalization camp seems to have been somewhat delegitimized by this. I mean, before this happened, the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, they were boasting of these direct flights to Tel Aviv. The Emiratis had hosted hundreds of thousands of Israeli tourists, I think, at this point, and they were, celebrating Jewish holidays in Dubai. And in the end, it was the Qataris who were the ones who helped end the war, and of course, once again, help rebuild Gaza. So it seems kind of like that aspect of this is a huge embarrassment as well.
Very much so. And they are put on the defensive. And we notice, as you just suggested, especially the UAE, which was extremely provocative and explicit in the promotion of normalization, that they have been retracting. And we didn't see any images, oh, look, we have wonderful Israelis visiting UAE and so on and so forth. So, I mean, this is tremendous change. I mean, but this shouldn't be surprising, Rania. Those despots have their pulse on Arab public opinion as much as Thomas Friedman has it. They are clueless. They don't meet average people. These are people who only meet these, mercenary Lebanese journalists who basically bow down and prostrate to any passing oil prince anywhere in the world. This is their sample of Arab public opinion. So obviously they were misled. Obviously they don't know what people think. But now they were told right in their face, Palestine is still very important.
Exactly. And then I wanted to ask you about this as well. I think it's an interesting aspect of the resistance side of things. I think we both remember Hamas withdrew from Syria in the beginning of the Arab Spring. And there was a break in its relationship with the resistance axis, which also included, of course, Iran, Hezbollah, and others.
Right.
But now there are signs that they might have a rapprochement with the Syrians, Hamas I'm speaking of, and the Syrians, and they've openly acknowledged the importance of the Iranian role in supporting their military, which is a kind of a big deal after what happened with the Arab Spring. I mean, what do you make of this? Do you think this is a rapprochement between Hamas and the Syrians after the sort of break we saw in the beginning of the Arab Spring where Hamas, at least some elements of Hamas, turned against the Syrian government?
Yes, there is that going on, Rania. I can report exclusively to your audience that, in fact, I know for a fact, not analysis, that in the last 2 months, there were secret meetings held in several countries. Turkey is one of them, in which representatives, not only of Hamas, but also of the entire Muslim Brotherhood, that are now extending their hand to the Iranian axis in the region as a whole. Muslim Brotherhood, especially after the rapprochement between the Qataris and the Turks on the one hand, and the Gulf countries and Egypt on the other hand, they are trying to reassess their whole strategy. And part of that is Hamas. As you know, I mean, Hamas was of two minds on the subject of Syria and the Middle East as a whole. The military wing of Hamas in Gaza continued to be on very excellent terms with Hezbollah and with Iran Revolutionary Guard. I mean, they basically felt that they were indebted to them because they received training, money, and so on. And by the way, the Iranians, people don't know that, have been giving money and arms not only to the Islamist groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but even the left-wing organization, which were active in the last war, like the Abu Ali Mustafa group, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist organization. They also have been receiving Iranian aid. So that the military branch of Hamas always was on good terms with the Iranian axis. Now, the political wing, especially the exile group, were of a different mind, and all that has changed. It's fair to say there has been a convergence now between the military wing of Hamas and the political leadership towards a rapprochement with the entire Iranian axis, and that's going to change the relationship with the Syrian regime as well. I mean, a lot of things are changing in the region today, and I think that the agenda and the example of resistance, especially after Gaza, is going to rise yet again. And yesterday, there was a press conference by the leader of Hamas in Gaza, Sinwar, and he was specifically asked by a correspondent for Al Mayadeen about the relationship with Hezbollah. I mean, and I think a lot of people were hoping that maybe Hamas will say a word against Hezbollah and so on. And if anything, he went over to say, we have been coordinating with them continuously throughout this, and we are on the same wavelengths and so on. And also, that resulted in Saudi regime media went ballistic against Hamas and denounced all resistance groups in Gaza and so on. Imagine, Rania, just to tell your audience how the Saudi regime's policies are. The Saudi foreign minister was able to give a long speech at the United Nations General Assembly, speaking about what is happening in the Middle East, and yet not uttering the word Gaza once. Not once. Spoke about Jerusalem, spoke about Sheikh Jarrah, but not the word Gaza.
Incredible. I mean, I think it's also interesting to watch, you know, the Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all these people who were in fact saying yay for Palestinian resistance, but also, you know, don't have an anti-imperialist outlook on the rest of the region. We're cheering for, you know, Palestinians in Gaza. There was like a subset of people, maybe I would call them like some liberals in the Middle East who are pro-Palestine. But then the second, you know, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are thanking the Iranians, that must be a huge embarrassment for the Gulf states in one sense, right? Because they have this big, Cold War with Iran. But also it's like this failure to acknowledge that Palestinian resistance wouldn't be possible without the Iranians. Or, you know, or help from Hezbollah as well.
Right. You're absolutely right. And that was very embarrassing to them. And they were hoping, I mean, those quarters really relished the potential of a rift between Hamas and Hezbollah. Because those people, I mean, you know them in Lebanon too well. Those in Lebanon, some of them, especially the fake leftists, who are aligned with the most right-wing groups in Lebanon. So those fake leftists, like Al-Yasar Demokrati and others like that, they basically claim that they are against the resistance by Hezbollah and Hamas, but they support some kind of resistance. But it doesn't exist. It is some like nostalgic resistance that existed back in the 70s, which was an abysmal failure. I mean, I was part of these secular far left people that, you know, presented an example of resistance, and we did a lousy job. Israel was able to come from the borders into the outskirts of Beirut in few hours. I mean, it was a total miserable experience. The PLO and the Lebanese National Movement failed miserably. This is like championing the performance of Arab armies in 1967. That's how absurd that example is. I mean, so for that reason, they keep speaking theoretically, that they are theoretically in favor of resistance, but not any resistance that takes place today. So yes, and some of them ignored that, as I said about one example. So they spoke about Sheikh Jarrah and Jerusalem as if nothing happened in Gaza. I mean, they have so little credibility that they are not worthy of us mentioning them.
But I do have to just mention the irony of watching certain people say, oh, the Palestinians are under attack. Where is Hezbollah? I'm talking about the Lebanese, the sort of Lebanese. But if Hezbollah were to get involved in a war with Israel, these would be the same people who would be saying, oh gosh, Hezbollah got us involved in a war with Israel. It's like with this particular crowd, you just can't win. You just can't win.
And somebody asked me about that in Arabic yesterday on Clubhouse, and I answered at length by saying, one, what you just said, that those are the same quarters. If Hezbollah responded, they'd be the first to cry, they are taking us to a war. And if they didn't respond, they would say, look at them traitors, they don't care about Palestine. My response to those who said, why didn't Hezbollah respond? I am glad they don't respond, because we tried the impulsive, irrational, indiscriminate responses that made no sense whatsoever. That's what they used to do. That's what the PLO did in the 1970s. Somebody got angry and they would lobby missiles, Katyushas and so on, without any kind of resistance. We have now a different kind of resistance movement that are not impulsive, that they treat resistance as a science and they operate according to formula and metrics. And I think that's what effective resistance should be about, and not the Yasser Arafat PLO style, which was entirely performance and theatrics.
100%. As'ad AbuKhalil, professor at California State University. It's such a pleasure always to have you on. We hope to have you on again soon. Thank you so much for your analysis.
And happy birthday yet again. Take care, Rani.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Well, Rana, you're getting all sorts of birthday wishes here. Happy birthday to you again.
Yeah,
Sorry
I guess I
cut
should
you off
very
there.
quickly. I should very quickly just mention we had a couple super chats. Speaking of birthday wishes, we had one from Faint Signals from Vega saying, "Happy birthday, Rania. Thanks for all you do. Palestine will be free. Empire will fall. Solidarity." Trish from Tasmania. Thank you, Trish.
Okay.
And then Tony,
Tasmania.
1987. Thank you for all the hard work you all do, comrades. Hashtag Free Palestine. Thank you, Tony. And once again, if you guys want to throw money in the super chat, we will, of course, shout you out and read your comment, assuming it doesn't say something really weird. Usually it doesn't. Sometimes it does. On that note, I'll hand it over to you, Eugene.
Yes, no, thank you. What time is it in Tasmania? Shout out Tasmania.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you for watching.
impressive.
It might. I
Right?
don't know. I'm not even going to try to guess what time it is. We're going to keep the movement moving on here with the show. We are going to turn to some. Maybe you could call them European affairs, is maybe the best way to look at it. Imperial hypocrisy is another way. We are very happy to be joined as we keep the show going here by Mark Ames, who's a journalist, an author, and the co-host of the War Nerd podcast. Mark, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me on, and happy birthday, Rania.
Thank you.
I wish I had like
Amazing.
a bell or something.
I know. I wish we could just ding, ding, ding.
Maybe like a
Ronnie's
Dan Patrick
birthday.
show. Well, you know, Mark, here we are yet again with another sort of Russiagate adjacent controversy taking over the front pages of many major newspapers here in the West. A lot of outrage being expressed in different ways. Maybe before we get into some of the broader controversy, if you could just really quickly, for those who maybe have been living under a rock, give a sense of why Belarus, Russia are in the news and why people seem so outraged about it.
Well, since last year, Belarus has been, large protests broke out last year after a extremely dubious election, yet another one that Alexander Lukashenko, who is the authoritarian leader. I mean, he's a dictator, and he's not good. He held, and he's been in power since 1994, and his crackdown since then has been unusually brutal. I would say that the opposition to him, unlike in earlier years, is very large, wide scale, and popular. And the crackdown was quite brutal. So that's kind of the background A. And background B is what was it? Just a couple days ago now, one of the opposition leaders, unfortunately, Roman Protasevich, who runs a very effective, especially during the protests. I mean, I used to watch it a lot. Nexta, it's like an online social media site, but quite effective in terms of organizing protests and keeping people worked up about protesting against Lukashenko. Anyway, he was flying from a meeting in Greece, I think a plane from Athens, Greece, to Lithuania, which is where a lot of the exiled opposition is based right now. And the plane was forced down over while it flew over Belarusian airspace. It was forced down under some BS pretext. I think they claimed that Hamas had phoned in a bomb threat, thinking like, the West will have to get behind us over that. Everybody's against Hamas. And the bad thing about the Hamas threat is that it gave a lot of hacks who do not want to look into Protasevich's own past. I mean, it's, you couldn't write these scripts. Evil Putin couldn't write these scripts if you wanted to. Protasevich is a goddamn Nazi. I mean, one of the worst, actually. And this is on the one hand, you have a guy whose life is miserable right now. He's a young guy, ran this very effective operation, they wanted him to arrest him, to scare dissidents, to get all of the intelligence that they're definitely going to get from him. But he's a bad person, you know? I mean, there doesn't always have to be two good people in a story,
Yeah,
right?
Nazis are bad.
Yeah,
Nazis are
I think
bad.
we can all agree Nazis are bad. So this guy, you know, volunteered to serve with the Azov Battalion, which is, I mean, Azov Battalion has this global white supremacist, neo-Nazi reach, a lot of shootings even outside of, you know, Nazi-inspired massacres and activists outside of Ukraine have been very inspired by Azov. It's, you know, it's a terrorist group, and this is who he went to. He basically trained up with them, and then after that, he went from that to, you know, Radio Svoboda, Radio Liberty, and the Václav Havel. He was a Václav Havel fellow,
Wow.
you know, in Prague. I mean, it's you can't make this shit up. And when this first started to leak out, I mean, there were some really good, actually, Ukrainian emigre academics, Ivan Kachanovsky, Vladimir Ishchenko, were pointing, you know, we're looking into this and saying this looks real. And of course, immediately, all these disinfo warriors jumped all over them, accused them of being conspiracy theorists, especially Ivan Kachanovsky. I mean, it was savage and really, I have to say, really just disgusts me and pisses me off. These are people who are supposed to be monitoring disinformation. What they really do is monitor information that is uncomfortable to NATO and uncomfortable to people who've invested everything in demonizing Russia and getting the Cold War going. And so, you know, eventually even Bellingcat admitted, yeah, the evidence is there. He served in a Belarusian unit with the Azov Battalion in 2014-15, which is when they were doing most of their killing. I mean, Azov Battalion was basically formed as a death squad because the regular Ukrainian army would not go into pro-Russian or Russian-speaking towns and villages and suppress them and kill them, basically. And so the army was pulled out and they raised these so-called volunteer battalions. It's a classic death squad strategy. And Azov was the most fearsome because they're the most Nazified and, you know, full of criminals and fascists and even jihadists fought with them. So it's, you know, it's a big problem. And what Westerners have decided to do is just pretend it didn't happen. You've seen, I saw in the Times UK, Mark Bennett's had a couple paragraphs on Protasevich's Azov ties and Nazi past. And when it started to leak out, he deleted it. Because the thinking is among these people, well, we can't do something that helps Lukashenko because he's bad. We can't tell our people the truth if the truth hurts our enemies or bad people, which is every dictator's reason for protecting, you know, the public and having to censor, right? Except our journalists censor themselves.
Yeah.
So the whole
Mark,
thing.
Mark, you also mentioned, I saw you tweet this, and this is a really good point, is that it's not as though there aren't other protesters that have been like jailed by Lukashenko. Like they just decide to pick this neo-Nazi.
I mean, you know, I guess because he was the one that was down an airplane, and then you have to deal with the hypocrisy of the West.
Right.
Obviously, the Evo Morales plane was forced down. I mean, Obama didn't have to call in a Hamas threat to force it down because he could get NATO satellite states to lock down airspace and force it down in Vienna, and Snowden wasn't on the plane. You know, Lukashenko doesn't have that power that Obama has, so he has to call in a Hamas bomb. I mean, it's so fucking ridiculous. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, look, Lukashenko has the Lukashenko regime. I hate that word, but I'm going to use it here. Government, whatever, has stomped, arrested, beaten thousands of protesters, activists, journalists, opposition figures, and people. And of all of them, of all those people, the one they have to choose, you know, they're going to name a street. Romania announced that they're going to name a street after Protasevich, just like all the streets named after Nazis that you have in post-Maidan Ukraine now.
Crazy.
Yeah. You know, Michael McFaul, my old friend, going back to my exile days, who was the ambassador, he, you know, he said, you know, free Protasevich. Protasevich is a hero. We all must worship Protasevich. It's like, then, you know, you just put it next to a photo of him. There are photos all over the internet, not only of him in his Azov uniform with the wolf's angle and the Azov patch. I mean, he did propaganda for them, right? I mean, he did propaganda for them and fought with them and got wounded in battle with them. These guys were not, you know, these guys were death squads. That's what they were. And
well, yeah, I mean, it goes also back to like what was actually happening in Ukraine, right? Because to acknowledge who this guy is and who he was fighting with would be to acknowledge that the people the U.S. is backing in Ukraine include in them elements of neo-Nazis, because the Azov battalion that you've been talking about has actually been the recipient of U.S. weapons. And that's been a huge controversy. Well, not a huge, it hasn't been as big a controversy.
Hasn't been nearly enough.
It's been a tiny controversy on Capitol Hill.
But
I mean, the U.S. is just right. But this is like the same. It's like the same tactic. You know, it's like the Syria tactic, but in Ukraine, where you like, you know, the rebels, the moderate rebels, but they're also like a bunch of jihadists. In this case, there are a bunch of Nazis involved. And then whenever any of them complain, you turn them into a hero. Even like, wasn't that guy in a video with an ISIS flag? And in this case, it's like, wait, wasn't that guy in a video with like a Nazi flag? I mean,
it's and there is a commonality there, because you remember how they would. I mean, the reality is, Al Qaeda, Al Nusra, HTS, whatever they call themselves this week, they're the most radical, most extreme, most reactionary fundamentalists, and they fought best, right? I mean, none of these rebel groups were all that great at fighting, but they were the most effective fighters. They wanted to kill and murder and actually fight and blow themselves up. And that's the same with, I mean, this is the playbook with Ukraine too. The more Nazi you were, the more eager you were to murder Russian speakers. You saw them as subhuman animals who were, you know, poisoning your great Ukrainian culture, and you want to murder them. Those are the best fighters. A lot of them didn't, you know, like I said, the regular army was pulled out. They didn't fight. You need people. So Protasevich, his next is very effective, very good, and he was, you know, doing a lot of interviews. I mean, he's pretty courageous as fascists go.
You can't accuse him of not being brave, I suppose.
Yeah, no, actually, although on the other hand, he did break pretty quick. I mean, he was already doing the confession. Granted, I would do a confession and name everybody. Not saying I wouldn't, but if you're a Nazi, you know, I mean, Assange hasn't done his confessions, you know, and he's been in, so fucking Nazi, you know, he could at least hold out for a few days, Mr. Nazi macho.
But there also is something to be said about like, there is something to be said about the fact that, okay, yeah, Lukashenko, obviously not exactly a Democrat. Like, this isn't democracy we're seeing in Belarus. At the same time, this doesn't have anything to do with democracy, right? It's the EU trying to strangle a country for being too close to Russia. Am I correct to say that?
No, I mean, I think what's fair to say is, I think the main thing to say here is that Belarusians are screwed. Because of where they are. You know, they had it pretty good for a while under Lukashenko. Lukashenko came to power in '94 because Belarus did what Yeltsin did, and a lot of, and I think what Kravchuk probably did in Ukraine. Belarus's first leader did too. The shock therapy and all that stuff, and it was roundly rejected by Belarusians. And I would say Lukashenko was generally, in a kind of passive way, supported and not opposed until, you know, I think it got worse. It just got worse over time. He's been in power so long. But the standard of living in Belarus up to a couple of years ago was high, you know, plenty higher than in Ukraine, for example, like a lot higher. And what he did is he reversed a lot of the privatizations and kept the economy much more nationalized. He's he's a conservative. He's not like, you know, Hugo Chavez or something. I mean, they I'm sure had common ground in some ways, and he's not a liberal in the economic sense. Lukashenko also, it needs to be pointed out, is not a Russian puppet. I mean, for that matter, you know, Yanukovych wasn't a Russian puppet. It's really stupid, more propaganda that we get. And Lukashenko's not. And in fact, he's been a difficult ally for the Russians. I mean, if you were to say what's the Kremlin's sort of ideal with Belarus is stability. And Lukashenko, the longer he stays there, I mean, they've been trying to get him out since about 2010. They actually tried to organize at least one time a kind of color revolution to get him out of there. And the West was supporting him. And the West constantly would go back and forth, and you had these McFaul dorks thinking, we can end the sanctions against Lukashenko and we can bring him on our side, split him off from Russia, and then we'll sort of throw in our NGOs and color revolution and so on. And Lukashenko would just kind of play ball back and forth. And even now, I mean, the Russians, I think, from everything I'm reading, even in the New York Times, even from the opposition, agrees the Kremlin is furious at him for downing that plane. Does nothing for the Kremlin. And you have freaks like Timothy Snyder, Yale's Holocaust revisionist, saying it's possible that this could only be done with Russia. And since it's possible, it's true. And since it's true, we must punish Russia over it and cancel the upcoming summit. So Russia definitely is not happy with that. And they're not sure how the hell to get rid of Lukashenko. But yeah, to your point, Rania, the West's strategic goal is to destabilize the place, to make it hard for Russia to govern it. If the West was the West, NATO, the US-led international order, whatever you're going to call it.
The rules-based international order.
The rules-based international liberal order, yeah. If they cared about Belarusians, they would say, we will groom people who will be neither, overly pro-Russian nor overly pro-Western, who will work with both sides. There'll be, they won't be hostile, and they'll try to do sort of very orderly transitions. But that's not in America's interest. That's not in NATO's interest. Russia is a rival. It's an adversary, and the interest is to destabilize Russia as much as possible by destabilizing the areas around it. And so we put money into Nazis and other radicals. Tsikhanovskaya, one of her top aides now, is a nationalist, Veronik Viechkora, I think his name is. I mean, he has old ties to a lot of the similar kind of National Front type groups that Protasevich is involved in as well. Belarusian National Front groups, Youth Front, all this kind of crap. So I think, though, what is happening is the longer Lukashenko stays in power, the more he represses people, because Nazism is not popular in Belarus. I mean, they lost a quarter of their population to the Nazis. It's not been a historically hyper-nationalist place. They didn't have like the Western Ukraine. They didn't have any of that. Not for lack of trying. The West, NATO, the NGO structures have tried to, kind of instill that, and that's why somebody like Protasevich is so useful. But I would say that, the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that younger opposition people are going to be more radicalized. They're going to start diving deeper into Belarusian mysticism and fascism and anti-Russian ethno-nationalism, and it's just horrible. It's horrible and it's sad. And the other option is staying with Lukashenko, and he is just getting exponentially worse by the week. And so they're kind of just they're screwed no matter what, it seems to me, and it's sad.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you're on Russia's border, I guess, and the U.S. I mean, that's crazy that the idea of stability, as you're describing it, it seems like, and this makes sense actually, because you can apply this logic to Syria as well, is Russia does want stability. I'm not saying they're the good guys all the time, but that is in their interest. Stability is in their interest, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you want the opposite of what Russia wants, then you just want to destabilize everything to hurt Russia. So sorry, Belarusians.
One thing that is also sort of sitting behind this for me is, we're in the midst of this so-called global conversation around anti-Semitism, and the whole media is like, people who are for Palestine, they all are just anti-Semitic. And it just, I don't know if it's through the looking glass, cognitive dissonance, but then you see on the other hand, here are the same people supporting these political forces in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet states that are actual Nazis.
Yeah, I'd go almost a little bit worse. I've seen a lot of people on the left who, or on the putative left, whatever, who stylize themselves as anti-fascist and have been anti-fascist, and researching and exposing and going after the far right in this country and even abroad, even Azov Battalion. And also being anti-Russia and really buying into this narrative that, NATO is a progressive force. There's a lot of that in the progressive side, that NATO's a progressive force, and that, Putin is this sort of, octopus evil guy who's like he's sort of the head. I think it was one of Hillary's people called him the head of the alt-right Comintern, and they really want to believe that. And a lot of these disinfo warriors want to believe that. And here you have a situation where Protasevich, it's undisputable now that he was with the Azov Battalion. But you're having these same people who've been like screaming about Nazi hunting all the time on social media and through their research and through their papers and so on, saying, well, maybe he was, but he was a journalist. Yeah, like basically he makes Andy No, or however you pronounce that, look like Rachel Maddow. I mean, you're going to call him a journalist. Like Protasevich is, I don't think you call a guy who's suited up, armed, and got wounded in battle with the Azov Battalion, the most extreme, largest Nazi paramilitary group in the world, a journalist, right? And they're finding excuses for him, and they're coming out and saying, well, we can talk about his Nazi past later, but first we got to get him out of jail. As if Lukashenko's like, I don't know, not sure, but they're not talking about his Nazi past anymore. Okay, you can go free. Like, Lukashenko doesn't give a shit. This is only between us and what we're willing to talk about. And the reality is, when you suppress that and whitewash it, again, you create tankies. I mean, you subvert people's trust and belief in your narratives again, which is supposedly what Putin does, and you lose them. There's nothing to be gained by pretending that Navalny wasn't a xenophobe, and getting that out of the way, and then talking about why it's bad and good now or something. And there's nothing gained by covering up for Protasevich's Nazi past. It's real and it's bad and it's frightening.
It really is. I mean, I saw someone send me something, this is actually a few months ago, about Stepan Bandera in the Ukraine. And it was like, well, was he affiliated with the SS? Of course. Was he involved in the Holocaust? Absolutely. But he was a nationalist, not a Nazi. I mean, I don't even know what that distinction is, but it was just stunning to me that someone would even try to make that argument at that level. And it was, we were in a relatively civil conversation, but in service of basically saying, well, we should support Ukraine and we shouldn't even really be concerned about this glorification of this, SS individual.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say also is that what this showed with all these people on the left who stylize themselves as anti-fascist, anti-far right researchers, disinformation warriors, that when push came to shove, the most important thing for them was fighting America's rival, making sure, even willing to self-censor and suppress information about a goddamn Nazi, in order to help America's cause and hurt America's official state enemy. And that is messed up. You got to have some principles. So you're not principled actually about any of this far right stuff. What you're principled about is helping NATO and helping America. And this is like, I don't know. It's depressing. Yeah. Very depressing.
It is depressing. It is depressing. It's through the looking glass. It's outrageous. It seems like, what world am I living on? Well, Mark Ames, really appreciate you giving us some time. Really hope folks check out the War Nerd podcast. Fantastic podcast. You're also a journalist, author, great stuff all over the place. Really appreciate you being here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me on.
No, of course.
Have a good birthday, Rania. All right.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Mark.
guys. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, Rania, we've actually gone from your birthday into another day, I think, in the course of this almost. But let's keep it going all weekend. Very happy to be celebrating.
My birthday's just go. My birthday doesn't end. I do want to give a shout out, though. We had a couple other more super chats from Ireland. Gregory Casey. I can say that I'm delighted that he's delighted that Assad won in Syria. And I mean.
Well, okay, so he's got some fans in Ireland.
I mean, whether he was going to win. I will say that we do need to at some point soon have like a show devoted to Syria. Syria's kind of been lost in the news, but I live right next to it. I'm in Lebanon,
That's
and
true.
Syria is suffering under crippling sanctions
Yes.
that have destroyed the economy. So we will get to Syria relatively soon. And
So,
thank you for
folks
the
of
super
People of
chat
Ireland
donation,
will be there
Gregory. Hello to Ireland. Also, Tony 1987, happy birthday, Rania. Thank you. Yeah, I will
Year,
take that message any
1987.
day. Thank you very much. That was, I think, a second super chat from Tony. This was,
No,
I
shout out
think,
to you, Tony.
I know I always say this, Eugene,
Go ahead. Say
but
it again.
I do mean it. This is my favorite episode of the Freedom Side.
Well, if everyone is your favorite episode, that's good because it means that we're constantly improving our craft.
This might stay my favorite episode because it's my birthday episode. So,
oh, that's right.
I mean,
that's
next
right.
week it's going to be hard to top it next week because it won't be
gonna
my
be very
birthday
hard to top.
anymore.
I should have gotten you like an edible arrangements or something like that. I don't even know if they have that over there. It's delivered right now at 3 a.m. in Lebanon.
To Beirut, Lebanon. I think by
Listen,
the time I
DHL,
got
they
here with
deliver everywhere,
DHL,
right?
the fruit wouldn't have been good anymore, but I'll
Okay.
take it.
Well, let's bring the show to a close on that note.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you to all of our fantastic guests. Thanks to everybody who watched here. Thanks to everyone who donated in the super chat. Thanks to everyone who did or is going to go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and make a donation there. Become a patron. We've got many great things for you. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're not watching on YouTube, you should go to YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. Make sure you hit that bell so you can get the alerts of all the fantastic stuff we're doing here at Breakthrough News. And we will be back with you again next Thursday here on the Freedom Side.